Sorry, let me get into the speaker view. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session of Neomadness, Studies of Dream and Derangement by Jason Mohaghegh. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Jason to begin the session.
All right, thank you. Everyone take a deep breath today because we're going to inhale a lot of things at once. I'm going to overdose you with schizophrenic information, the more conventional, but also a lot more of the experimental theories of schizophrenia, as well as some of my own unpublished theories of schizophrenia, as yet unpublished, as well as a whole bunch of other things. So just let's follow along, and then we'll get to what you were able to mastermind alongside Cuban and watching Estamira and all that. I'm looking forward to that. And we'll get into all that, and then the presentations at the end. So let's start here. Can everybody see the screen? Screen is apparent? Yes? Okay. So if you recall, last week we got into manic experience. Well, we want to do the same thing just quickly. So just bear with me on this, where these were all the manias. Well, schizophrenia works somewhat differently, both in conventional sort of psychoanalytic diagnosis, but also in its performativity. So let's start with this symptomatology. This is straight out of any medical journal. This is the kind of universal psychological diagnosis. Schizophrenia involves a range of problems with thinking, cognition, behavior, and emotions. Signs and symptoms may vary, but usually involve delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech, and reflect an impaired ability to function. Symptoms may include delusions. These are false beliefs that are not based in reality. For example, you think that you're being harmed or harassed. Certain gestures or comments are directed at you. You have exceptional ability or fame. Another person is in love with you, or a major catastrophe is about to occur. Delusions occur in most people with schizophrenia. Hallucinations. These usually involve seeing or hearing things that don't exist. Yet for the person with schizophrenia, they have the full force and impact of a normal experience. Hallucinations can be in any of the senses, but hearing voices is the most common hallucination. Disorganized thinking, speech. Disorganized thinking is inferred from disorganized speech. Effective communication can be impaired, and answers to questions may be partially or completely unrelated. Rarely, speech may include putting together meaningless words that can't be understood, sometimes known as word salad. And you guys remember Estamira's own dialect and guttural kind of moments? That's something very similar to that. Okay, extremely disorganized or abnormal motor behavior. This may show in a number of ways, from childlike silliness to unpredictable agitation. Behavior isn't focused on a goal, so it's hard to do tasks. Behavior can include resistance to instructions, inappropriate or bizarre posture, a complete lack of response, or useless and excessive movement. Negative symptoms. This refers to reduced or lack of ability to function normally. For example, the person may neglect personal hygiene or appear to lack emotion, doesn't make eye contact, doesn't change facial expressions, or speaks in a monotone. Also, the person may lose interest in everyday activities, socially withdraw, or lack the ability to experience pleasure. Okay, so this is your point of departure. Remember, our job here is to twist and distort the conventional psychoanalytic categories, but it's not to say that they're not accurate in 90% of schizophrenics who you will locate in asylums. They are accurate. It's just that we are not interested in 90% of schizophrenics. We're interested in the 10% who are the exceptions to the rules, right? So that's what we're looking for. So we go next. These are neo-symptomatologies done by more experimental psychoanalysis today. So the first one, there are studies recently on what's called subvocal speech. And what they're trying to say is that all of the conventional psychoanalysis, which attributes schizophrenia to a range of hereditary or environmental triggers and all of that, actually may be missing the boat, that it may be a neurological and mental disorder that's related to a problem with subvocal speech. So what's subvocal speech? That's when you guys mumble or mutter to yourselves, when you talk to yourselves. Well, it's been discovered, and it's being increasingly studied, that schizophrenics have a difficulty with this. And that is why precisely they have a non-relation to their own internal voice, which is to say, when we say they hear voices, really it's they're hearing their own thoughts as other voices. So there's a recognition problem there, right? So it's the hearing of inner voices as sinister external forces, right? Susceptibility to auditory hallucinations and subvocal speech that go increasingly loud, aggressive, painful, and persuasive. This is what happens to the voices in the head of the schizophrenic over time. The voices become louder, more aggressive, more painful, and more persuasive. The reason for that is twofold. One, it's been discovered increasingly that they may have what's called a defective recognition circuit, which is that part of the brain which allows you to recognize your own voice or your own internal monologue as your personal thoughts doesn't trigger or light up in the brain sequencing the same way. Okay, so it's experienced as a foreign, again, outsider voice. The second thing is that they have some difficulty with, or they have some difference in subvocal speech. And there's debates around this. When do you typically mutter and mumble to yourself? When you are confused, stressed, or frustrated. It's a release mechanism. It's a way of talking yourself through something, correct? If you lack that, then what happens? You become increasingly hostile, increasingly agitated, because you don't have that purging valve, right? But the other thing is then, so the question is whether they lack the ability to mutter and mumble to themselves, or if they're in an amplified state of subvocal speech, which is when they rant and rave, right? And they can't keep thoughts inwards, which is a kind of how Deleuze and Guattari also understand schizophrenia as constant externalization of the internal, in which case it becomes so manifest that it feels like it's coming from the outside, right? So that's another way of understanding it as well. Okay. Another thing is that there have been recent studies, and these are fascinating, by contemporary psychoanalysts showing that there's a temporal dissonance among schizophrenics often, which is to say that they experience schizophrenic time as a short temporal lag. There's a longer window of temporal integration. It's going to blow your minds when I tell you how they discovered this. There's a doctor who put schizophrenics on roller coasters. And yeah, and monitored their pulse rates and their reaction times to the fear, the free fall, as opposed to so-called normal subjects, to discover that they experience the rush later. Okay, so what happens is when the schizophrenic conscious, I'm reading from my own notes here, by the way, this is from an unpublished book that's later this year, the schizophrenic conscious hears its own thought in a slight delay, echo, or loop that then causes it to misrecognize inner discourse as an outer imposition, as an infiltrating whisper of the other, such that a simple split-second lapse in synchronicity with so-called real time of thought engenders a suspicion of being under siege by suggestive strangers, gods, demons, enemies, etc. The monologue becomes an uninvited dialogue that they cannot map back to themselves, perhaps linked to a certain tachypsychia. Now, this is what's cool. You're going to say, so, oh, interesting, schizophrenics have a slower temporal. No, it's because they're faster. They exist in an accelerated mind state, which we can only simulate during near-death experiences. So if you know that experience of why your life slows down or why everything slows down before a car crash, right? Imagine if you're perpetually in a state of tachypsychia, okay? Experiences of terror, which causes a slow motion effect of reality. And again, the forerunner cognitive studies on schizophrenia's pertinence to temporal discrepancy, which include measuring critical fusion frequencies of individual memory, reaction time, and retroactive perception while in states of terror spiking, examples, roller coaster rides, can be found at the following. I'll send you guys, by the way, that article. That's one of these weird, obscure ones that I discovered. They did the research on it, though, and put the schizophrenics on roller coasters. So, okay, apophenia, a lot of you probably know that term. Apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between seemingly unrelated things. The term comes from the German apophany, was coined by the psychiatrist Klaus Conrad in his 1958 publication on the beginning stages of schizophrenia. He defined apophenia as, and this is where schizophrenics will see number sequences in things and attribute, again, all kinds of semiotic, profound kind of meanings to them, that they're usually tied to conspiracies, they're embedded, they're sort of cryptographies of some kind. But the interesting thing there, he defined it as an unmotivated seeing of connections accompanied by a specific feeling of abnormal meaningfulness. He described the early stages of delusional thought as self-referential over-interpretations of actual sensory perceptions as opposed to hallucinations. So these are not hallucinations because they're things that are actually there. They're just over-interpreted and given a kind of abnormal meaningfulness. Now, an interesting subgenre of that Conrad didn't look into himself, but others have, is pareidolia. And that's the perception of images, sounds, or faces in random stimuli. So it's kind of like when kids see things in the clouds, they see shapes in the clouds, except if they believed that, right? You will see this sometimes among theologically minded people, which is to say religiously, particularly intense religious believers might see something like the silhouette of Christ in their toast for breakfast, right? And things like that, or in blood spatterings, or so they'll see certain sacred symbology involved in that. Remember, we're trying to mess with things here. So even if we did the most simplistic version of distortion, which is to reverse, imagine someone who sees things in faces. Reverse pareidolia. That's coming out later this year also. So that's an interesting thing when you start to see object worlds in subject worlds, not always just the subject within the object. Okay, and lastly, now this is just emergent, and I got my finger on the pulse of this because I think they're onto something here, that increasingly there's a suspicion that the neurochemistry of the schizophrenic mind is extremely similar to those who are experiencing lucid dreaming. Now that's a cool breakthrough, if that's true. Because lucid dreaming, which is, when you know that you're dreaming in the middle of a dream, and it's a kind of a sudden rush of adrenaline and a sudden sense of kind of almost exaltation and euphoria, because you feel like you have immense power, sort of then in the dream world. You can do whatever you want, a kind of limitlessness. That's why lucid dreamers who can sustain lucidity, which means if you don't wake up right away, if you can remain in the dream state, you start to find yourself becoming insightful, highly creative, also, but just based on that suspicion that none of it is real, and there's a lot of spontaneity that can occur in lucid dream. So that's all things that you find also in Van Gogh or Socrates or any schizophrenic Estamira, high levels of insight, creativity, spontaneity, but also suspicion that none of it is real. Okay? So those are new symptomatologies related to subvocal speech, temporal dissonance, apophenia, lucid dreaming. We go next. Okay, I want to tell you a little story of a gentleman named Victor Tausk, 1879 to 1919. Victor Tausk was one of the earliest members of the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society. So he's part of Freud's earliest group, except Freud didn't like him from the outset. Why? Because Victor Tausk's first work he was the author of a book called The Psychology of the War Deserter. He was in the war. He was in World War I. He went and he performed psychoanalysis on people there, except that, and so did Freud, by the way. And something to note is that Freud, one of his absolute most stunning works, but it's something that's very rarely read, is an article he wrote called Thoughts on War and Death. And in Thoughts on War and Death, it's very short, very powerful, very simply written. But he basically attributes war to a kind of sublimation, mass sublimation of death drive. So society can't have all of you walking around wanting to kill one another. That kind of vigilante, anarchistic violence would lead to the dissolution of society. And so he actually thinks in a kind of conspiratorial way that the political structures, political regimes understand that the video games aren't enough for you, and the horror movies aren't enough for you, and the going to the theater and the cinema, watching murder and all that isn't enough for you. Still got to get it out of your system. Let's do it in at least a semi-organized, brutal fashion called war. That's his theory. Okay, that war is essentially a mass sublimation of individual death drive into collective death drive. Okay. It's a huge theory, especially for someone writing in World War I. But the problem is then that Freud boxes himself in very claustrophobically to then how that pendulum swings. Because when there's repression or sublimation, it can only lead to neurosis, according to Freudian psychoanalysis. So that works in 99% of cases where people come back from war with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder. right? Which is a neurotic, anxious condition. Freud's right about that. But what he can't explain is Alexander the Great. Okay? There's a reason why, by the way, I'll just tell you guys, this is a personal thing. You know, Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus is an absolute masterpiece. It's a wonderful work. Whether you hate it or like it, or you have to just be in awe of the immensity of it. Except I think it has one major problem, to be honest with you. I think they chose the wrong madness, which is why I wrote my books on mania. I think what they should have aimed for was mania instead of schizophrenia, and I'll explain why later to some extent. But schizophrenia is a very powerful sort of state of mind as well to extract things from. But I'll explain why, because Alexander the Great is more manic than he is schizophrenic. And the reason you can tell that is that, okay, so for those who don't know, here's what I want to get into. Victor Taust, this young psychoanalyst, he studies not neurotic behavior in war, PTSD, post-traumatic stressor, psychotic behavior in war. Now that's different. Ecstatic behavior, enraptured, delirious behavior, manic behavior. And he particularly finds this in whom? Deserters. So he actually wrote a book, The Psychology of the War Deserter, which Freud detested because it ran against the wave of neurotic analysis that he and all of his crew was doing. Instead, he was chasing all these weirdos who went AWOL from the military and went off into the middle of nowhere and like Brando in Apocalypse Now. Okay, if you guys have seen that great sort of scenes of Brando in Apocalypse Now, that's precisely the psychology, the psychosis that he was interested in, which is a positive state rather than a negative state, to use the terms. So here's the thing: Alexander the Great was that way. How is Alexander the Great different than any other conqueror? He didn't centralize his empire around his home. He left Macedonia and never came back. Total non-return. Also, he was known for a chameleon-esque adaptation. Wherever he went, he became like the place he went. So that's where when he went to Greece, he gave up all his Macedonian cultural affectations, started speaking Greek, started wearing Greek clothes. Then he goes to Persia, marries a Persian wife, learns Persian, wears Persian robes. Then he goes off to India, starts going in. Weird kind of going native tendency has. That's a manic disposition, where you allow yourself to be shape-shifted by external environments, right, and outer influences. Another perfect example of that, for those who don't know him, is T.E. Lawrence, famously known as Lawrence of Arabia, who was a gay, schizophrenic colonial officer from England, sent to the middle of the Arabian Peninsula to help conquer it, and instead he turns into this. Right? Fascinating. Goes from the left, where he's in his traditional colonial officer. Look, I want you to look at something else, because there's something I didn't teach you guys, which is that there are contemporary studies going on right now by a group of women at, I can't remember, women psychoanalysts at, I can't remember where they are. They're not even psychoanalysts really, who've discovered that mania has a physiological tendency towards pupil dilation and a changing of the eyes. Now that's interesting, but what I'm even more interested in is that I started, it's a weird thing to try and prove, but I started studying that they also have the effect of causing pupil dilation in those they contact. So there's physiological responses to mania too. If you're good enough, and this is what the hypnotists were able, this is what Rasputin can do, right, with his dark monastic gaze. There are certain figures who can look deep and cause your own pupils to dilate with a hyperfixation. Point is, look at the gaze on the left when he's still supposedly semi-normal in England, and by the right, when he's adopted Arabian clothing. And by the way, it's completely anachronistic and archaic and flamboyantly weird. It's not accurate even to the time. It's a kind of hallucination of his own of Arabia. But you look at the look on his face, that's the face of a pure manic on the right. Right there. So he's way gone at that point. Now we go back to Victor Trask here. So beyond hypermimicry and the chameleon-esque adaptation, a different type of psychotic warfare. So here's how Victor Trask ends. Notice if you look at his dates, he's 40 years old. In 1919, and this is important for you to know as the backstory to the person I called our enemy at the outset, both a god and an enemy. In 1919, Victor Trask, a disciple of Sigmund Freud, committed suicide by simultaneously hanging and shooting himself. Quote, "I have no melancholy," he wrote in his suicide note, which was addressed to Freud. My suicide is the healthiest, most decent deed of my unsuccessful life. His essay on the origin of the influencing machine in schizophrenia, which has since become a classic in psychiatric literature, had just been published. It was essentially banned by Freud, by the way, just so you know. On the morning of July 3rd, 1919, after Hélène Deutsch, that's a psychoanalyst under Freud, had stopped Tausk's treatment after Freud had demanded it. And after a complicated relation with Freud and Lou Andreas Salome, that's who Nietzsche proposed marriage to, Tausk committed suicide by tying a curtain braid around his neck, then placing a pistol against his right temple and firing, hanging himself as he fell. Freud wrote to Salome that, quote, I confess that I do not really miss him. I had long realized that he could be of no further service, indeed that he constituted a threat to the future. Yeah. So that's heavy. That's a human being on the left there, this Victor Tusk, and a brilliant one at that. Exiled and excommunicated from the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society, left untreated and driven into suicide, and then mourned very coldly like that as a threat to the future. Well, his masterpiece is actually his small article, which is one of the first great insights into an exceptional state of schizophrenia, which was the influencing machine. So let's read this together. On the origin of the influencing machine in schizophrenia. Basically, it's this belief that some schizophrenics have that they're being manipulated by some elaborate, distant mechanism or apparatus. Usually it's represented as a marvelous, intricate machine of many levers, wires, wheels, gears, spinning glass globes, often shooting rays or emitting luminescent colors. It always has, the influencing machine has a mystical or diabolical quality. Now, this is really fascinating by Tausk that he figures out. Sometimes, on the rarest occasions, it's not a machine, it's represented as a body double. So sometimes the schizophrenic claims that they have a fragmented twin or a shadow replica of themselves, and that's the machine. Weird, but that's what it is. The mechanism is usually run by a single overseer or a secret society of technocratic minions. They can be alien, they can be demonic, they can be political too. This is what was called a passivity delusion, later by a psychoanalyst named Kurt Schneider. Passivity delusions are when someone feels that they're not in control of themselves, or they're only in partial self-control, right? And that they're being persecuted by phantasmatic forces. Okay, there are three functions to the influencing machine, usually in the narratives of people who have this condition. The first is that the machine is there for mind control, the second for purposes of torture, and the third for purposes of surveillance. Okay, component of that, mind control meaning the removal and insertion of ideas. That's fascinating. So it's both that they can delete thoughts from your head and information. So every slip of memory is intentional, is conspiratorial. Nothing is accidental, nothing is a lapse of cognition, right? But also the insertion of certain ideas or thoughts, right? The infliction of physical pain or bodily mental deterioration. That can, by the way, include wounds, that can include disease, that can include anything. They attribute it to the influencing machine, as well as involuntary sensations and reactions. If you remember, Estamira started having like vomiting kind of motions and heaving sort of and all of that, and she blames the remote controls that are doing this. That's your influencing machine, okay, at work. The main effects, now this is excerpted directly from his article. The main effects of the rest I had written up for you, but this part, the main effects of the influencing machine are the following. It makes the patient see pictures. This is awesome, it has a cinematic quality. When this is the case, the machine is generally a magic lantern or cinematograph. The pictures are seen on a single plane, on walls or window panes, and unlike typical visual hallucinations, are not three-dimensional. That's very cool. It produces as well as removes thoughts and feelings by means of waves or rays or mysterious forces which the patient's knowledge of physics is inadequate to explain. So this is also part of the struggle, is that they claim that they have partial knowledge of the influencing machine, but never full knowledge of how it works. Okay. In such cases, the machine is often called a suggestion apparatus. Its construction cannot be explained, but its function consists in the transmission or draining off of thoughts and feelings by one or several persecutors. Third, it is also responsible for other occurrences in the patient's body, such as cutaneous eruptions, abscesses, or other pathological processes. To the left, you'll notice an image by Jacob Moore. He's an early schizophrenic patient, and this is his drawing of an influencing machine that he did while he's also a political activist, interestingly, a famous political activist who becomes institutionalized. All right, and that's your influencing machine. Next, it also produces motor phenomena in the body, supposedly, erections and seminal emissions that are intended to deprive the patient of his male potency and weaken him. Tausk did note that this was more common in male schizophrenic patients than female schizophrenic patients, although there have been documented cases, many, of women who also are susceptible to projections of the influencing machine. This is accomplished either by means of suggestion or by air currents, electricity, magnetism, or X-rays. Next, it creates sensations that in part cannot be described because they are strange to the patient himself, and that in part are sensed as electrical, magnetic, or due to air currents. So one of the earliest examples of this, early 19th century, we're talking early 1800s, before Charcot, who you're reading next week, before Freud was even born, you have James Tilly Matthew drawing the air loom, if you notice on the left. And if you want to take one of my absolute favorite mad people, Antonin Artaud, on the right, you notice that in his book, 50 Drawings to Murder Magic in 1946, what do you got there? Looks like an influencing machine, right? Okay, here we go. What's the difference between mania and schizophrenia? This is some of my theorization. The first distinction is a distinction between object obsession versus subject obsession. So the example is, I'll make it real simple. Alice's first initiation, by the way, this doesn't mean mania and schizophrenia are opposites. What I'm arguing here is that they start from the inverse direction and get to the same point most often. Okay, that's the intriguing thing. That's why Artaud hates Lewis Carroll, because he starts from the end for Artaud, not from the beginning. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So the first thing is, Alice's first initiation into Wonderland is to disproportionately distort herself for the sake of the bottle, the mushroom, and the key, right? So it's the abandonment of self, the sacrifice of identity and self and the I for the sake of the object, the thing, this little implement. That's more important than she is. Versus the hyper projection of the name in schizophrenia. So if you notice schizophrenics, they say their name constantly. Estamira, how many times does she refer to herself? Artaud is constantly referring to Artaud. And even Nietzsche, towards the end of his life, is constantly in third person referencing Nietzsche. Right? It's partially performative and theatrical, but it's also part of a kind of schizophrenic modality. Now, don't worry, they end up contaminating both. Subject becomes object in schizophrenia, and object becomes subject in Alice in Wonderland and mania. But it's just whether you start from extroversion or introversion. Okay, which is to say, do you start from the inner, the I, being the object of concentration, or from some foreign weird white rabbit? You get it? That's out there. And if you want a good classical example, just to show you that we don't need modern Western philosophy and psychoanalysis only, boom, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Persian and Japanese medieval portraits to show you a perfect description of the contrast between mania on the left and schizophrenia on the right. Mania on the left is the outward gaze, the extroverted gaze towards everything but himself in a kind of delirious, euphoric drunkenness. This is Persian sensualist poetry and mystical poetry. So he's following the shapes, the hallucinatory sort of skies, the cup of wine, the harp, everything around him. Versus the schizophrenic insularity and self-enclosure that is dragging the whole universe towards itself in the Japanese woman on the right, which comes from Japanese ghost and horror kind of genres, pre-modern, right? Storytelling. Okay, so you see that she closes the eyes. It's an internal phenomenon that then draws everything towards itself. Okay, cool. So that's the first way to understand the distinction, whether you start from the object or the subject, even though both, again, become gravitational poles or magnetic forces that collapse everything into the same moral pool eventually, right? So I becomes it. And by the way, Kafka has a beautiful way of doing that sometimes in his diaries. There's these scary, eerie moments, even at a minimalist level. You don't have to go so flagrant as mania and schizophrenia. In the minimalist registers of Kafka's tonality, there are moments when he says it instead of I, and it freaks you out. Instead of saying, I look forward to seeing you next week, he says, it looks forward to seeing you next week. And it's game over. You're in a really, really bad trench of the mind all of a sudden, right? An air of suspicion. So a second way of distinguishing mania from schizophrenia I found in my own writings is the relationship between immensity and particularity. So the example is that in manic experience, you begin from acute specificity of a single object, the white rabbit again, right? Versus the schizophrenic hallucination of cosmic forces. Notice the first way that Estamira introduces herself is referring to universes, universal phenomena, right? Gods and weird cosmic vendettas. So they start huge. Manic starts small, tiny usually, right? Usually an inimitable, irreproducible phenomenon, like the one white rabbit, or a single watch, or a single ring, or a single, that's Gollum's mania in Lord of the Rings, right? There's only one ring like that, right? Eventually, it's not everything, which is how the schizophrenic starts. Eventually now, the manic fixation does expand compulsively to become a universal desire. If anybody knows how mad love works, meaning falling in love, obsession at that level usually, even though it's for the one that you then elevate hierarchically above all others, suddenly you start thinking that you're seeing her or him in every love song on the radio, and every person passing in the crowd. So you start to magnify it, okay? So that's how the particular becomes the universal there. The schizophrenic begins from a universal plot that then collapses inward towards the schizoid depth. Remember, that's a Deleuze-Guattari term of the self. So this is why Estamira can have, let's say, a really acute attention to little objects and all of that, that fit in the grander narrative. She just starts from the grandiose narrative and then sort of buries it in every artifact that she discovers. Whereas the manic starts from a search or a quest for some small artifact, some singular artifact that then becomes a universal phenomenon, okay? This, Deleuze was onto it in Logic of Sense, where he speculated that there's something to do, forget Deleuze, it was Nietzsche's insight in Twilight of the Idols and in Gay Science that Deleuze gives him credit for and says, Nietzsche figured it out that it's all about surface and depth. And the way that he uses Nietzsche's meditation, Nietzsche has a great meditation in Gay Science on what happens if we lose the sense of depth. Well, we also lose the surface, right? And it becomes this vertigo. It's a great, great exploration of Nietzsche's. And he says, that's exactly why Artaud hates fairy tales and he hates Lewis Carroll, is that it's all surfaces and he's a schizophrenic who's all depths. Now, the funny thing is, the reason why he still wants to claim it and say that he wrote it is because they end up in the same ecstatic explosion and detonation of affects at the end. It's just he doesn't get the methodology, because you're supposed to start from the schizophrenic depth, not from, you know, sort of the horizon in that way. Okay. Next, this is an interesting thing. Both mania and schizophrenia have a potential to speak the unknown, but I want to qualify this. Socrates had a hatred of stupidity. Actually, I think it's Plato ventriloquating Socrates there. But Plato has a deep hatred all the way to Heidegger, right? When Heidegger sort of has this despicable rasp that he calls people the they, right? That's the they. It's so dismissive. It's so elitist. It's great at some levels. I don't mind it. Kierkegaard says the crowd is untruth, but it's also kind of grotesquely misanthropic. The problem with that is that what they fear stupidity does, and that's the fool or the child at the dinner party, is that they blurt out the public secret. And this is what Freud thought too, is that the worst thing imaginable is for someone to unveil the buried unspoken of your unconscious. And that's not true at all. It's the one who speaks a fresh terror neologism. meaning someone who shows you that the most threatening image is not the one that you repressed, but the one you didn't know even exists yet. And a great example of this that I'll give you is from a psychoanalyst, a contemporary one still alive. Francois Flaucheau wrote a book for Verso, the publisher Verso, called Malice. I don't think that book got anywhere near the immense importance that it should have been given. I can't believe nobody knows that book when I asked him if you read Malice. It is fascinating and brilliant. And in it, he says something. He says, at the first introduction, the preface, he says, I'm a psychoanalyst who realizes psychoanalysis is obsolete for what I want to talk about here. And I love that he confesses that. And he says, here's the problem. He goes, when I was a little kid and I was like 6 years old, my older brother snuck me into the city in France to go to the cinema, the one little cinema we have, to watch the movie Frankenstein. Black and white, old Frank. This is like 80 years ago. And he said, and I wasn't ready for it. He said, I was too young. I didn't anticipate that. And I saw a face on the screen that devastated me. He said, from that point forward, when we got home, every day my chore had been to go into the cellar, the basement of our little French cottage, and get coal, shovel coal into the furnace. And he said, and now when I entered the dank darkness of that cellar, I could feel the heat of the monster on me. I could feel the breath of it behind me. I could picture the face on the walls. It was terrifying. I would run upstairs as quickly as I could, panting, and I couldn't express to my brother or mother what was going on. And he said, now, he said, what Freud would do if you were here is to say you experienced a trauma, except that's not correct in the conventional sense, because trauma is typically experienced as an internal phenomenon, something that you repress, something that came from you. He goes, that face of the Frankenstein monster did not come from me. That was brought to me by someone else's design, someone else's diabolicism. I had no clue that anything like that ever existed. That's where psychoanalysis has trouble. What happens in the face of true horror, which is to say the awe, the awesome/awful encounter with something that you never could have anticipated, right? For which there's no language. That's the state of absolute vulnerability or fragility. And the schizophrenic and the manic can sometimes project a level of discomfort in their ability to unlock that type of experience. They don't say to you what you already know about yourself that you don't want anyone else to hear, right? That's what the child does. The child says, you're old or you're ugly, right? And then everybody like tries to shush them. I once saw a child, I've given this example before, sorry, but I once saw a child brilliantly at their grandfather's funeral yell out, he's dead. And everyone shushed the child because the funeral ceremony is a cover-up of death. It's a repression of death, right? It's a ritualistic sort of concealment of the dead. That's why all the photographs of the dead are not of them in their current deteriorative state, but in their past idealized state at the prime of their lives. All the stories are from when they're alive. It's not, well, Bob is, in the coffin. It's not in real time. So the child wasn't deferring, wasn't deflecting, wasn't shelving finality or mortality. And then they did the worst thing, which I thought was amazing. They went up next to the coffin and imitated the grandfather. They went horizontal, laid down on the ground and closed their eyes. And the mother grabbed them and pulled them away. And I thought, what an intimate gesture. They couldn't see that. While everyone else was trying to differentiate, why do people eat after funerals? It's to differentiate that they're alive. And then there's survivor's guilt involved. It's a complex mess. People suffer. Anyway, the point is, we go next to Estamira herself. Now she's going to teach us a few tricks. I'm just going to, because I know you guys have a lot of things, I'm just going to go from some of her first comments. The first line we get is she refers to my mission. That's an amazing thing. Most people don't walk around, unless all of you are medieval knights that I don't know about. Most people don't walk around with a concept of mission. You may have goals, God help you, because you may have listened to some self-help New Age gurus teach you to be goal-oriented, but you probably don't have a mission, right? The imperative, to exist in the imperative, right? Remember, Nietzsche said to philosophize with a hammer, and he's constantly speaking of commands, the will that commands itself. Well, she can do that. To reveal the truth, that's her mission. Okay, I don't care about the word truth. I care about the word revelation here, because to even reveal something means that things exist in a state of either occultation or occlusion. What's the difference? Occultation means something is hidden, like in a cave somewhere. Occlusion means something is covered. Right? Those are two, they're not opposites, they're just two variations on how things can be hidden. The Arabs in the class here can know this. I think Arabic has 28 different words for hidden, because there are different methodologies of hiddenness, different forms of hiddenness, which is great. All right, then she says, so there's a problem in the hidden versus the apparent world. Okay, by the way, again, remember, I know, I hope no one takes offense. This is the only reason I have any sympathy for it. This is the birth of the ideal forms of Socrates, who's a known schizophrenic by every symptomatology, right? So he talks with demons, you know about that, right? He claims the demon talks to him all the time. He goes to oracles, right? All sorts of stuff. So anyway, he stares at the sky a lot. Anyway, this idea of the hidden versus the apparent world, the ideal world, that's a completely schizophrenic complication there. No one is innocent, she says. That's important because something that Deleuze and Guattari noticed is that schizophrenics connect things. That's why they're interested in rhizomes, like weeds and vines that tangle into other things. But you don't need even them. All you have to picture is that if I'm a schizophrenic teacher of yours and I come into this virtual space and I believe that Andrew is trying to poison me, right? I have a paranoiac delusion that he's trying to poison me. I'm watching him as I'm speaking. Schizophrenics can compartmentalize really beautifully, where they can be talking at one time and thinking another thing or watching another thing. So as I'm talking and I'm going kind of on automatic here and I'm proceeding along and you think this is my main axis, I'm really watching his hand gestures right now. His eyebrows just went up. I'm watching his eyes when they squint, when they don't. And let's say I see that he has somehow in my mind given a signal to Edna over in the corner, right? There you go, there's the signal. Now she's in on it, right? But then I noticed that she just made a comment and it's a response to something that James said. James is in on it too. Give me until the end of the class and you will all be in on it, right? I will make connections, I will create bridges based on what? Not inexistent logic, but very slippery, small, incidental, right? This is apophenia again, kind of incidental connectivities. Someone dropped their pen and someone picked it up, right? They're together on this, whatever the grand plot is. Which is why nothing in schizophrenia is ever experienced as irrelevant to the schizophrenic subject. That, I want you to hear that, because that is the antidote to the condition that most of us exist in all the time, which is a state of modern alienation. When you walk down the streets of New York City, what's law number one? Don't look in anyone's eyes and do not say anything to anybody. Pure alienation. Look at the paradox, the contradiction architectonically. The most congested, interconnected place in the world, no one touching, no one looking, no one talking. The schizophrenic is the opposite, right? There's no boundary between self and other, or that person, that they're all in a kind of lattice or a silk rug that is thread together. Okay, it's a fascinating way. And again, the best example of this aesthetically, if you go to Van Gogh's skies and you see how he swirls his skies into oceans, into people, into everything, you see the schizophrenic depth that does that. Okay, where were we? So no one is innocent. Wise guys in reverse. Baudrillard had a beautiful line at the end of his life when nobody was paying attention to him anymore, where he said, beware things that are irreversible, but also beware things that are reversible. It's a great line, and he's absolutely right. Well, she claims that the whole universe is in reverse. That's a massive gesture, right? To think things are upside down. She says, I am not common, but she does note that we are all common. I like that. That's good of her, right? She says, you're all common, but I'm not common. So the schizophrenic often sees themselves as a singularity. If you read Artaud, he says the same thing. If you read Nietzsche, he'll say the same thing. Nietzsche says things like, there are two histories, the one that lives after me and the one that lives before me. I have broken history in half. I love it. It's amazing. It's so much better than the neurotic narcissism of a mediocre academic who's like, I just published an article in a journal. If you're going to go arrogant, go full arrogant. Go Nietzschean arrogant, right? Sort of like that. The punster's grudge. Now that's cool. Notice she has all these beautiful vocabularies, astonishing one. The punster's grudge. So there's conspiracy, there's trickery, and there's vendetta. And by the way, there's a kind of pagan and ancient nature to this, that the enemy is a trickster god, in a way, right? That's an interesting thing, because when you deal with trickster gods, there's something fascinating that people realize, which is that the greatest trick of the ancient Egyptian trickster gods, or the voodoo sort of trickster gods like Papa Shango and others, is that sometimes you need them. And sometimes on those weird rare nights when all the good gods are in chains or wounded, they save the world. So it's not the pure evil of monotheism where Satan can only do malevolent acts, right? The punster sometimes, she laughs at them, sometimes she's hateful. There's a whole mix of affects. But notice that she has an enemy of many names. She's got tons of names for the enemy. The hypocrite, the scoundrel, the astral father, the wise guy, the punster. If you guys read, this is no joke when I say that the first literary novel, the so-called first novel in so-called Western literature, is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. And it's a schizophrenic. This first modern novel, which is given credit, is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and it's a schizophrenic. His name is Raskolnikov. If you know your Slavic etymology, Rasko means schism, literally schism. His name's Schism Guy, right? You couldn't get more, right, obvious than that. But even if you go way, way back to the very first supposed origin of Western literature, rage Achilles, Homer says. And Achilles is either completely manic or schizophrenic as well, if you know how to read him, depending on how you read him. Okay, so there's something there that it haunts kind of the background. Hamlet, has some weird things that go on with, as well as others. Okay, so the enemy of many names. Bloody recorders. There's a little bit of the influencing. She keeps referring to all of us as bloody recorders. So recording devices, because we're conformist. And it's also a theory of mass enslavement. Everybody is sort of doesn't know they have that. Almost sounds like a Marxian kind of principle of false consciousness. By the way, Marx didn't use that term, but it gets attributed correctly to him, right? So you could say that even the Marxist narrative has this sort of schizophrenic supposition of a state of mass enslavement. He seduced men and tossed them into the abyss. That's the narrative backstory. That's a very cool thing, is that there's always a sort of a backstory of how this happened, and it's based on the fact that the major forces of the universe are misleading forces or unreliable forces. She claims, and this is an amazing claim, that in this human form of an old woman, that she has taken on a disguised form, that that's not her authentic self, but only a camouflage in order to elude her enemy, the punster or the hypocrite or the whatever. She wants to expose and knock down his whole gang. Schizophrenics linguistically are known for threats and boasts. It's great. It's like sort of ranting war cries all the time of what they're going to do and all that. If you want an excellent example of this, read George Buchner's Lens. Has anybody ever read that literary work? Buchner also was the guy behind, God, what's the famous one that, Wojciech, that Werner Herzog did a film of. He loved madness. Lens is a weird figure that shows up in some village, and he goes up on mountains and he communicates with God, but usually through rage. And there's this absolutely gorgeous sentence in Buchner's short story of Lens, where he says something like, and he could have dragged God down by the throat from the skies to the earth and chewed him in his jaws. Right, that's a kind of a nice schizophrenic condition there. Let's see. She claims that he still wants more, referring to her enemy. There's always an insatiability of the self and of the enemy. So it never ends. That's an important thing, because schizophrenic delusions, if left to go on, they never end. So the story doesn't have an end point. Because remember that it universalizes. So as long as there's things in the world happening, the story has more sagas, has more chapters, because it can always be extended in that way. Landscape. This was an interesting kind of deflection. You notice when she started blurring the names of her spatial surroundings with her own name. So she starts collapsing estamira into words like fields and hills and mountains, all that. That is a perfect, I mean, I was shocked when I saw that, because she's essentially theorizing the relationship of the schizophrenic to atmosphere, which is exactly what happens. Their presence sort of starts to invade the walls, the hills, the skies, the rain, right? She says she loves work. Now, the reason I extracted that, and her work is a very brutal kind of form of labor, going through the trash heaps sort of throughout the day. The reason is that when you have a fatalistic validation of purpose, meaning when you have this immense task, you are the center of the universe, it allows you to endure painful material conditions. That's just a fact. So here's a nice example I like to give, and I think I gave in another seminar. It's well known that Napoleon was shot off his horse 37 times in battle. By all laws of probability, he should have died many times over. Also, there are only 4 figures in the history of emperors and kings who always rode at the front of their military, even until the end of their lives. And I've sometimes asked the trivia. First is Alexander the Great, always first in line. Second is Genghis Khan. Third is Nadir Shah of the Persian Empire, who poked his own son's eyes out in a paranoiac state that they would overthrow him. And fourth is Napoleon. I'm not exalting these figures. I'm asking a weird question. By all laws of probability, they should have perished on the battlefield 1,000,000 times over. Is there, when you have some fatalistic concept of invincibility, that you can't die until you conquer the world, does it raise your actual probability of survival in something as material as war? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. If that wasn't the case, we would not have so many ritualistic gestures before warfare since the ancient world. Coating yourself in war paint, chanting, right? Blessings that go forward. To this day, there's so much ceremony in these god-awful state militaries. It's all magical sort of profusion. It's all magical ritual. You follow? Because they know it works to some extent. Okay, let's see. Estamira is everywhere, she says. She said many times. So that's a theory of immanence, right? Let's see. I love work. We did that. Remains and carelessness. So she's talking about the trash heaps, and she claims that they are remains. Now that's interesting. It's not waste. It's not nothing then. They're all signs. And remember, we talked about apophenia. So there's your apophenia. She sees signs in everything, but she also believes that everyone else is indifferent to the signs or blind to them. That's the carelessness part. She refers to herself as a vision and a necessity. And God help you when someone thinks they are a necessity to the world, right? At the most sort of sadistic, genocidal level, you get your ideologues who are absolutely entranced by their sense of inevitability. And on the other side, you get these individual rogues like her who are just unstoppable forces. So even 20 years after some obscure Brazilian documentary is done of her, we're sitting here across the world for some reason haunted by her image. There's something to that. There's something about that that is unstoppable. She refers to that people befoul her and desire her pride and her sadness. This is to say that schizophrenics often inhabit a state of paradoxical moods. Schopenhauer, of all people, referred to this torment as the infinite simultaneity of God. Now, he didn't actually use any of those words, neither torment nor infinite nor simultaneity. But basically what he says in the German is, I would never want to meet God if he exists. His misery would tear my heart to shreds. That's the line, that's the aphorism from Schopenhauer. And the reason is because God has to experience everything at once. And that's a mess. That's screwed up, right? It sounds good to say the infinite, but when you actually have to absorb and inhale and experience on the same side street, a little girl laughing while she's playing with a ball and a bum vomiting all over himself in pain and despair, and you have to inhale that simultaneously, that's pure madness. So that's why Schopenhauer thought God must be tormented. Even Žižek has a book that he wrote with a Croatian theologist, a theology professor, called God is in Pain. It's a good title, not as good a book, but a good title, at least. God is in Pain. All right. She says as if she's some great post-structuralist theorist. All is abstract. Terrific. Now, this is important because you would think of all people, Monsieur Deleuze, the sorcerer of vitality and of, becomings and all that, would not like abstraction. You'd think that's like, the Enlightenment stuff, abstraction. But actually, Deleuze loved abstraction. But he qualified what he meant by the abstract machine. He writes about something called the abstract machine, which he claims is not against the concrete, but against the discrete. Discrete not meaning discrete like secretive or hidden, discrete as in detached or separated, right? He claims that, so if you know anything again about the schizophrenic, nothing is discrete. Nothing is sort of fragmented or compartmentalized. What a weird paradox or contradiction for something named schizophrenia, which is seemingly a state of infinite fragmentation. It is, but it also is a unification process in a weird way that nevertheless allows for radical difference. Don't ask how that works, but it works. You see it in Estamira. The mechanism works. So abstraction there is just something that he claims doesn't allow the kind of subjective games that we play of individuation, of alienation, of mediation. So Enda's not me, and I'm not Andrew, and Andrew's not Dana. And you follow, like these things that we do constantly. They just don't occupy that sphere. How do you build a society? You name the street. Then you name the number of your house. Then you name, the titles of the people on the street. Then you name the city. Then you name the country. It's these constant demarcations, right, of separation and of bordering. And that's the exact opposite of what he claims what abstraction does. And if you want a good example of an aesthetic, look at Francis Bacon's portraits, which Deleuze adored. And he's one of the few visual artists that Deleuze ever wrote about. And you see these weird, mangled, blurring, melting faces of Francis Bacon. That's what Deleuze would call abstraction, right? Which is the opposite of what deconstruction does with abstraction. So if any of you know this, and it's not to be mean-spirited, Derrida was a brilliant figure. I don't want to, this is not a name-dropping thing. I actually had the privilege of taking two seminars with Derrida when he was alive at NYU. They were horrible experiences for me. I severely disliked the atmosphere. I found they were funereal and extremely pompous, and also had become kind of a satirical imitation of itself at a certain point, but still nevertheless an absolutely brilliant figure in many regards. Give him the respect, just not my ice cream flavor. And part of the reason is when they asked Deleuze why, of the million people that he always quotes everybody under the sun. He cites everybody. I mean, it's just a stew of, witch's cauldron of references. Derrida never gets a second of radio play in any of his writings. And the reason for that, he said very casually just once, well, I was never really that interested in texts. Now, what do we read into that? That Deleuze doesn't like to read? Deleuze wrote on Kafka. Deleuze wrote on Beckett. Deleuze wrote on Artaud, on Henri Michaud. He loves writers, Virginia Woolf. He writes on writers all the time. He doesn't like that type of abstraction, that concept of abstraction that is in the Derridian project, in deconstruction. That's what he means. Now, the last thing there, this violates all laws of psychoanalysis, is when she says, Estamira, so strikingly and fascinatingly, I am disturbed but lucid. And we get back to the lucid dream. And I can give you the host of figures: Daniel Paul Schreiber, Unica Zern, she's a genius, you should read her sometime. Václav Nijinsky, the dancer, who while he's writing his diaries, the diaries of Václav Nijinsky, the best dancer of his generation, the same way that Artaud was arguably the best actor of his generation, he's sitting there in his kitchen while his wife is cooking, and he's saying, my wife keeps talking. He's writing and just repeating, my wife keeps talking, she won't stop talking. And he's doing this. He's deeply conscious of the fact that he's lucidly aware of the fact that he is insane. So is Artaud, so is Gerard de Nerval, who when he writes Aurelia, writes the perfect description of a schizophrenic woman, and he's a schizophrenic. And it's not incidental, it's a diagnosis. which is why Artaud always says the best diagnosticians of madness are the mad. Just ask us, right? So the fact that she claims that that she is simultaneously disturbed but lucid is a major, major breakthrough for us to consider and what that means. Okay, now, where are we at? I've got just enough time to do something.
Sorry, Jason.
Yeah.
Armand's raised his hand, so I'm not sure.
Of course. Sorry. Let me stop sharing I can't see chats or anything while I've got the screen shared. So please go ahead.
Just a very quick question about the last point you made. I think maybe a question and a comment, but I think the most interesting part about Stamila was actually this lucidness that was very was there in the first as the first minutes of the movie. In the first 15 minutes of the movie, you can see this lucidity, and he and her illusions or his delusions or whatever, this system of meaning that she has for that's not important for what, but I think the lucidity or maybe I'm sorry for using I'm sure that you don't like this, but I'm going to say it in a kind of argumentative mood, but I think the beauty of it is actually the rationality of this madness. The beauty of it is that you can compute this madness to its lucid, beautiful, humanistic core. That is the beauty of Stamila, not just her illusion, in my opinion. And the movie perfectly portrayed this in the first 20 minutes, in my opinion, again. So that is basically my comment. And my question is that, so why we do, why we look at Stamila just like Freud did look at his subjects, schizophrenic subjects, that is, abstract from the subject just the repetitive exchangeable words of a common language. For example, we talk about abstraction because a word that she uses, but I think what we call madness in her or schizophrenia as a word is the semantic dissonance between our use of abstraction and her use of abstraction, because her use of abstraction is not commonly common. She is talking, in my opinion, where abstraction comes from. Before that, she's talking about foul astral bodies that desire her, right? That desire her but don't like her at all. Desire her, but they desire her but befoul the word. Because they desire her, they befoul the word. And schizophrenic reason would think to herself and would say to herself that, okay, what else in the world, what we see in the world, for example, water, for example, fire, everything in the creation is just this desiring of these befoul astral bodies that controls the fate of the universe. So if water is abstraction, then Stamila is abstraction. And because Stamila is the one that these gods of befoul astral bodies desire, then Stamila is as an abstraction presence in everybody. Because who is Stamila? Stamila is the absolute object. She is the one that what she talks about. Sorry,
No, I'm getting it. Go for it.
I think I'm doing a schizophrenic thing, right? I just get overexcited about this. But that was my comment. I can't continue about it because actually I wrote a little bit about it, but I prefer to not take many.
No. That's perfect. You know, again, there is a. So again, these days, you know, you guys are in a interesting time period. I'm a little bit older than many of you, and so reason and rationality didn't mean what you interesting folks are doing with it now. A lot of you, and some of the figures, Reza, a friend of mine, all that. I mean, what he means by rationality, I never would have defined as rationality 20 years ago when I was learning stuff, right? And so, yeah, if we semantically just explode the definitions of things to become much more versatile or much more flexible, why not? I don't care if you call it reason or rational. But even in the traditional sense of what I'm going to say, he's absolutely right, that you notice that there is a hyper consistency in her, right? You can meet her 3 weeks later and certain things there's a variability, right? There's a possibility for evolution of her narrative, but at the same time, she can go back and recuperate precisely her story, just like a masterful storyteller, and arrange things and align them, which is why it's interesting that Deleuze did one of the greatest gifts for Foucault. He wrote a thing about him saying that what people don't realize about Foucault is Foucault doesn't write from the vantage of the scholar of the insane asylum. He writes from the vantage of the mad. And the way you can do that is because he's a diagrammatician. He's not a scholar. He diagrams the asylum. And diagrams are the gesture, the mappings are the gesture of the schizophrenic. That's why if you guys have ever seen those movies where someone sees schizophrenic patterns everywhere, they've got that wall where everything is connecting, right? Where they've got a million cutouts from the newspapers and different numerical sequences that are posted up there. So yes, there is there's definitely an exercise of rationality that, in fact, I think is, how should I put it, a much more sophisticated form of rationality than what we call the instrumental reason of the everyday, right? Of everyday subjectivity. Should I get, whipped cream on my Starbucks coffee or not? Should I put 2 sugars or 3 sugars in, right? These little choices, these minuscule sort of indeterminacies that then guarantee, again, my individual sense of freedom and my delusions of self-importance. But that's not really, she's playing at a different level altogether of artistry, of ingenuity, of creativity. And of course, it requires what Deleuze and Guattari called beautifully a plane of consistency. There has to be continuity and synchronicity there. Also, that's the term that Jung even rightly uses, where he starts talking about synchronicity. Synchronicity is the moment when something happens in the world that feels like that's exactly how I thought it was going to happen, right? So it again has a kind of excessive meaningfulness, even though it appears as a random event. Now, give him his credit. Our enemy was Dr. Freud, was the first one to write psychoanalytically about déjà vu. And he has a fascinating little aside about that. And he also is the first one to write about ghost sightings, because in Germany and in Austria and in places like that at that time period, people saw lots of ghosts. And guess what? Mostly aristocrats. Freud learned very, very early that there was a kind of psychosis and neurosis happening simultaneously at the level of the superego, meaning the richer you were, the more messed up you were. Flash forward 30, 40 years to Nazi Germany, and you see that the mad are running the nation, right? That there's a certain fury unleashed and a certain pathology. Freud saw that to a great extent, and he saw that in his treatment of really severe conditions of individuals who were mostly aristocrats. Those are the ones who could afford it originally. And even Sabina Spielrein, who became one of the great psychoanalysts of the time. Here's a weird thing. Do you notice something that when you read Victor Taus, I said was being psychoanalyzed by one of Freud's other proteges. Jung was psychoanalyzed by someone. Otto Rank was it's because Freud made everybody undergo psychoanalysis. It wasn't something that he imposed on the sick or the defective or the abnormal. He himself had psychoanalysis. He used to have Jung interpret his dreams for him. Then he didn't like some of those interpretations, and there was some conflict there. But nevertheless, Freud believed it was something that everyone should undergo. That's why when he says that Victor Taus was a threat to the future, it's because he perceived his movement as having universal value. Oh my God, does that almost sound like a schizophrenic delusion? Yeah. I could show you a lot of places where Freud dabbles on the other side and actually steals techniques and tactics and even grandiosities. Stuff's contagious. You spend 8 hours a day in an office with someone who has delusions of grandeur, maybe it starts to rub off and you get some delusions of grandeur. Except here's the only thing I would say. Call his bluff. He really is that good. Right? And so are the others. So is Estamira even. If she was given the chance and the privilege of Freud, she could have started a movement. She has all the brilliance to do so. It's just her material conditions are kind of incidentally cast her to her height of her exposure being a documentary film and maybe some published writings on the side by an avant-garde press. So at any rate, But here's an interesting thing just for you to know. One of the earliest schizophrenics that Freud dealt with was a man named Daniel Paul Schreber. Have any of you heard of him? Some of you? Schreber was a legal genius, young protege, basically almost like third in line to be the Supreme Court judge of Germany before the rise of fascism. So we're talking 1920s, before it really starts to hit. And he has a total schizophrenic breakdown. So imagine this guy who's a total winner of the game. He's young, he's handsome, he's got a filthy rich family and a wife. Everything's going good for him. And he's like third in power in the country. He's at every aristocrat's ball, he's at every party. Schizophrenic collapse. Okay, there's a book by Eric Santner called My Own Private Germany, which is about Schreber being a prophecy, Schreber's pathology being a prophecy for the rise of the Nazi pathology in a weird way, like a kind of tremor before the earthquake. It's an interesting theory, and one can definitely read it that way, and Freud definitely read it that way. He's like, why does this extremely powerful, dynamic figure sort of collapse into a state of madness? Well, there's something even better than Freud's diagnosis of Schreber. The Case of Schreber, it's called, by the way, the article that Freud wrote. Something even better than that, which is that Schreber himself wrote an 800-page manual called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness by Daniel Paul Schreber. According to Freudian psychoanalysis, that should be freaking impossible. You should not be able to do that level of acute self-diagnosis. I would ask all of you to go look at the table of contents sometime, see the level of intricacy of the chapter titles, in which all of these things we're talking about exist. He believes that in what's called soul theft, which is that there are all these shadow figures in the world who are draining him of souls, and everybody else too, it's just they don't know it. He tries to explain it to the doctor. He knows the doctor thinks he's insane. He totally understands what the doctor is saying in his perspective. It's just the doctor doesn't get it. And he writes for 800 pages how the mechanisms work, how the machinations of these forces are, that they enter as light through his mouth every morning and they expel through his other orifices, especially his lower ones, per evening, and a lot of other intricate physiological and psychological processes that he documents with a scientific tone. Check it out, Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. Here's my favorite little anecdote about that. Freud, it's one of the only cases where he diagnosed someone from a distance, which if you know anything about now the contemporary psychiatric rules, that's a big uh-oh. You're not actually legally, I believe, I think it's even legally instituted at this point. You're not legally allowed to make a formal diagnosis of someone that you don't actually treat personally, which is why there were legal issues of defamation surrounding the former Supreme Leader of the United States when the entire psychiatric institutes and all of the sort of associations wanted to declare him a pathological narcissist, but they couldn't officially because they hadn't treated him directly, right? But Freud breaks this law. It's a Freudian law, right? Don't talk out of turn unless you've actually done your time in the trenches with someone. I like that Freudian ethics. I think there's something to that. But Freud does it for Schreber because it's just too cool a case. So when you go read Freud's cases on the Rat Man, right? You should read that sometime. It's really weird. Freud actually knew the Rat Man, but he didn't know Schreber. Now here's a weird thing. It's 15 years later after he publishes the piece, and he's in a horse and carriage going by the insane asylum in Germany where Schreber was committed and still lived. And the driver says, didn't you write about the famous Schreber who's up in the asylum? Again, imagine an age where the horse carriage driver knows psychoanalytic publications. We're so illiterate these days. It's hilarious to me. But yeah, this happens. And Freud goes, yes, I did. He goes, we could go up there and you could meet him. He's there. And guess what Freud says? No thanks. Doesn't want anything to do with that bastard. It is going to mess him up big time. He knows it. He's a force to be reckoned with, Schreber, right? And he's a threat to the future, as Freud would say. So real quick, where are we at right now in our time? We're at 6:17. Okay, just bear with me on something here. I'm going to try and do this really quickly. Actually, right, if we have to go to 7:30, then I'm not going to do this today. All right, let's actually shift because that's a lot of information. I was going to do something else with you, but let's shift to your selections for today, your writings for today, and see what you came up with Cuban and your prototypes of the schizophrenic. Who wants to go first? Informally, just some preliminary notes and ideas.
Come on, guys. No one's got any ideas?
Currently working on bringing up mine.
Come on,
so
I gave you
someone else
guys
wants
gold
to-
today. These were some gems. Play the game. Hit the ball
Yeah.
back, guys.
While I bring up mine, someone else can take the wheel.
I'm just looking for a little cartoon by a weird drawer. Tell me what you got.
I can go
Go ahead, Dan.
first, if that's
please.
all right. Everyone can hear me
Sure.
okay? Okay, I'd like to share a screen if that's okay, just to show the image that I picked. If I could do that quickly.
Can you?
Yes,
Yeah,
if everyone
yeah.
can see it right. Okay, so I didn't pick one of the black and white etchings and drawings that he had. I found this obscure painted one that he did for an exhibition in Germany in 1906.
Mhm.
And I thought it really represented something that I pinpointed within the Estamira documentary, specifically on the punster, the concept of the punster, and sort of like this visual manifestation of this entity of the man, of what he represents. And as I'm going by week for these writings, I kind of try and pick an impression of Neomadness and an impression of this beyond schizophrenia that we can then manifest and explore that deeper. So for this visual representation, trying to manifest it in its kind of like grotesque form and its more physical form, past the, let's say, auditory and visual or sensory schizophrenic elements that we identified as the symptoms that we saw earlier. So a quick quotation that I had written down. So by embodying the only truth of human man, which is the flesh and the blood, we can then start distinguishing the punster. And the punster himself is also distinguished by removing facades of symbolism and myth and worldly barriers, and where the punster then resides in this deeper nature, in this where he kind of acts out his effrontery. It's kind of a cognitive slip in the form of whispers that then turn into deep cryptic vibrations that then manifest this visual, physical, grotesque thing that, from the quote, we have the accursed, the unholy, the hypocritical, the scoundrel, the undignified, the incompetent, with his reversed power and his, reverse wisdom. He lied to men, he seduced men in this sickly form, and he blinded men, tossed them into the abyss, which this creature seems like he resides in the abyss himself, which is really interesting. And then even tantalized by the frugal remnants of someone who's within the realm of truth, the flesh and blood of some aging form, even that tantalizes this petty creature, basically. So so that's just a quick snippet of how I kind of go into manifesting it further and further. And then I even go into the punster himself finding his own truth and going into his own form of schizophrenia.
Ooh,
and his
good.
own
Tell
form
us about that. Tell us, because we don't have much on the punster from her. We know a lot about Estamira.
Yeah,
what did you project into that?
I even included, when I started going into the punster's form of truth, I included quotes from the extra reading of the Comte de L'Outremont's Maldoror. And from there, I kind of extracted the evil entity that Maldoror becomes, and kind of put that on this visual imagery here. So the Comte de L'Outremont, he kind of embodies this evil person. He was born evil, and he kind of becomes it slowly and slowly as he becomes less restrained by a character or a facade that he puts up. And so he kind of flings himself absolutely into a career of evil doing, and with his reverse genius depicting the delights of cruelty and delights which are not transitory or artificial, but what began with man, which began with the manifestation of the punster, will also end with man. So they kind of have this eternal enemy relationship between the man who is revealing utmost truth and who is embodying utmost truth, and then the punster who within his own truth has this own vendetta as well.
Excellent. Perfect. I've got almost nothing to comment to that because it is beautifully articulated. I would say you use the word, interestingly, as in a kind of intentional supplement to what you were saying. You said tantalized. An interesting thing, the myth of Tantalus, you know, it's a punishment where he's supposed to constantly be in a pool of water and not able to drink it. Every time that he goes forward to try and satisfy or quench his thirst, the water recedes, right? And Dante depicts this as well, but it's a more ancient myth. So just that's an interesting thing to think about it as well. When you said that sort of they're caught in this eternal enemy relationality and all of that, notice that what makes this very different from, let's say, narratives of, I don't know, what, revolutionary history, for instance, that also project these kind of almost cosmic level battles of, you know, dialectics and all that, is that they're supposed to end at some point. You have an end of history narrative, right? And hers, there's no concept of the end. And that's interesting because, yeah, I mean, it's just you have this cutthroat nemesis activity. And the word that you used, which was perfect for Maldoror as well, is gestures. Willem Flusser, who's a kind of underread and overread simultaneously figure of the 20th century, overread by the wrong people, I mean, that he's liked by people who should not like him if they understand that he's more devious a thinker. Willem Flusser has a book, I don't know if I ever told you something, called Gestures. And each chapter is just these sort of small, intricate gestures of things. Oh my God, why did I blank on this? The second most famous Argentinian writer of the 20th century, Cortázar. There we go. Julio Cortázar has a book called Cronotopios y Fama, something like that, where every chapter is a small little gestural thing, like how to wind your watch, how to walk up a flight of stairs, right? Things that are seemingly trivial and seemingly already understood, but when you actually disassemble them into their minutiae, then you start to see how odd and precarious and slippery they actually are, and how much actual rigor it takes to pull off even the smallest gesture well. And that's exactly what Maldoror is. It's not a narcissistic self-indulgence. That's the wrong way to read him. When you get beyond the delight and the Joker's slit smile that he does that Glasgow smile in Maldoror where he cuts the sides of the lips so that it looks like he's in a perpetual grin. When you get beyond kind of the apparent sadism of it, which is not sadistic at all, you realize it's a book of gestures, a book of tasks, and you're absolutely right to that. Very good, very cool. Where are we going next?
I was going to mention that Flusser also has this book called Language and Reality, where he argues for like the relations between the poet and the mad one, because he says the poet is in the limits of language and creating more language, and the mystic and the madman are like adrift outside of language, right? They are like outside of this boundary. So that's very interesting, I think, in Flusser, because this is like from the earliest Flusser stuff that I don't think is even translated from the most mystic and Heideggerian phase. Yeah.
Cool. I didn't know. I don't know why I don't know that word. Send it to me if you don't mind the citation. I know that Andrew mentioned his book on vampire squids, which is really cool. That you guys should check out as well. How he chose his topics is an interesting thing. He also, by the way, wrote a book that's very important for contemporary discourses of the refugee. He's the first person to really write a philosophy of the migrant. And it's an important book that he has there too. So at any rate, excellent. Yeah, cool. Okay, where are we going next?
All right. So,
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. I'll also share my screen in here. Unfortunately, I think I chose maybe a more boring Cuban piece, but regardless, assuming that, oh no, did it disappear? Okay, there we go. Give me 1 second. Share. Can everybody see this?
There we go.
All right, cool.
That's boring.
I mean, well, when you're placing it in context with like crabs fishing babies out of the water, it's a giant skeleton kind of. It gets a little bit more within the realm of knowable possibility, but regardless, so this was a piece, and I paired it with the sort of monologue that Estamita has about, I didn't begin revealing this until 1983, that I encountered a lot of abuse. So this is why I'm revealing to you that the comet lives in my head, and that whole gesture, the idea of that the comet was considered envious by the astral bodies because it didn't think it would have a use for a carcass like mine. The moon is not actually there, it's down here. It's a reflection of the contours that is down here, that sort of thing. This sort of cosmic equivalence between the thing that's in her head and the moon that is there but not there, and it's instead down here. And kind of teasing out the possibility of the symptomatology of schizophrenia, which also I want to make a quick aside here. One of the interesting things before we got into the neo-symptomatology is a lot of schizophrenic negative symptomatology seems to have a lot in common with depression, which there's a lot of interesting stuff you could possibly do in like capitalist realism and all that, but that's an aside. One of the obsessions, of course, is the idea that the self is great, that the self is this magnified, exalted self, right? So what I wanted to do with this particular painting, or not painting, drawing here, is to extract a possibility of what if the greatness is not something that is inherent to you as a person. It is of you, but not from, it's from you, but not of you, or is you, rather. But it's instead something within you, say your skeleton. So what instead I go off on is this tangent of what if you basically had a schizophrenic understanding that your skeleton is this constantly growing giant, that once you die, it will then take your place and become this perfect entity in a world that is covered in the sort of Arctic, Niflheim-esque world of ash and ice, and is instead, because it's a skeleton that is then made of iron that is able to keep growing, will eventually replace the entire universe. And of course, then the cosmologies of like, okay, well, the moon is now God's petrified eye, while his skull is hiding in the center of the Milky Way. And eventually, the skeleton that is going to be you, that is the great thing that you are, will then go on and dominate the rest of the universe as it keeps growing, as it keeps replacing these dead forms. And also, to bring it back to the particular gesture that the skeleton is making here, is also attuned to being able to find similar beings to it, maybe not necessarily always the skeleton that is within everybody. And in fact, the first declaration that I make is, you are all mothers to be. Even if you are not baptized as women, you are all mothers. You just don't want to admit it. And the mother that you are is the child, is your skeleton, essentially. The giant that is your skeleton and will become the giant after you are dead. And that the particular greatness, in addition to the invulnerability of this sort of steel giant, is that it will find the various creatures that will raise this sort of mythic level of the sort of land of giants that will come after you, rather than you being the great thing now, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. No, this is cool on many levels. And first of all, even just as an incidental thing, when you mentioned that this has a greater resemblance than let's say the other one to a known form. Yeah, but you notice that in the horror genre, historically, monstrosity always has to have some degree of resemblance to the human form in order to be truly terrifying, right? So it can't be something as kind of divorced from human form as the pen. This doesn't scare anybody, right? But so it has to have eyes, or the alien has to drool, or it has to walk, even if it walks with 3 legs, it has to, there has to be some points of resemblance. And that's interesting because schizophrenics too will know that they have some resemblances to people, even if they want to differentiate themselves in some grandiose way. Even Artaud says that he has a poem where he says, and what were Nietzsche, de Nerval, Poe? He says, they were bodies that bled and breathed and slept and snored, and every once in a while wrote one of those magical poems. 50 poems for an entire life. It's not much, and yet it's everything. So what he's saying there is maybe even 99% of the day, we are just like everyone else. But it's the 1% when we're not, that split second, that fugitive hour, when we can think otherwise and we can become something that had no right to be. That's the key. That's the key existential sliver that hangs in the balance. But there are resemblances still too. The next thing is an interesting point when you mentioned, just quickly, and then I'll get to the real content of what you were talking about, with the link between depression and schizophrenia. A lot of you may not know this. Félix Guattari was an actual practicing psychoanalyst, and he was actually a student of Lacan. And then later, of course, they tried to cut the throat of all of that edifice with Anti-Oedipus, and then later with Thousand Plateaus. Well, some people really like to read Anti-Oedipus as a Lacanian text, and it doesn't matter. I don't care about the names. But the interesting thing there is that Guattari actually experimented practically at his insane asylum, which was composed mostly of schizophrenics, with allowing the schizophrenics to decide the rules of the institution. So for those who don't know, he would let them set bedtime hours. Oftentimes he experimented with letting them wear the white doctor's coats and the doctors wearing pajamas and things of that nature to try and reverse the hierarchy. And guess what he discovered after a couple of years of these liberating experiments where they weren't the oppressed, but they actually were the rule makers? He discovered that it didn't do anything to cure schizophrenia. Right? They still persisted in delusions, which is okay because he wasn't trying to. But guess what he didn't have? Violent incidents at the asylum. So what that tells you is if you actually look at historical narratives and depictions of the fool or the village idiot in the ancient world, Foucault is right on here. We picture them as happy-go-lucky. And that's because the village idiot is actually part of the village, nevertheless, even though that's a cruel way of categorizing them. And it's a stigmatization. Nevertheless, the village doesn't let them starve, doesn't cast them out in the street to freeze in the cold like that pinnacle of modern civilization of New York City or San Francisco. Right, where I believe it's 34% of the homeless population is believed to be undiagnosed schizophrenics, or diagnosed for that matter, right? So you have this massive sort of cruelty in the modern era with these epistemologies of just discarding them. Try it next time. I always say this, I know this is a very basic thing. You're all super smart and as brilliant as they come, so you don't need me to teach you this. But if you just look at the urban mapping of wherever you live and try to remember or note where in your city, wherever you're living in the world, is the insane asylum located, or the rehab center, or the nursing home, or the orphanage, or the AIDS clinic, right? One after another. You probably can't locate them. That's modernity's exile and banishment of the unwanted, the undesirables, completely out of sight, out of mind. Whereas in the ancient world, they were part of the fabric, although often dehumanized or inferiorized or tormented. Sure, there's abuse, but nevertheless, they were part. People knew their name. I can even tell you as long as 90 years ago, my grandmother, there was the village fool in Iran. My grandmother knew his name, knew his parents' name, knew everybody's name. They all cooked for him. And of course, did they mock him? Yeah, it's a little bit of sadism there too in the village culture. Of course there is. But nevertheless, it seems even far more ethical than the current thing. Now, the interesting thing there is that there were less recorded episodes of schizophrenic violence in the ancient and medieval world than there is now. These mass shooters who are having psychotic episodes, according to the media, schizophrenic breakdowns, it's a very cheap and easy amateur diagnosis to cast it off on that. What you should be asking is whether there is something in the cultural currency of modern capitalist society that is inducing schizophrenic breakdowns. And the answer to anyone with half a brain is absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, can
Yes.
I know people get presentations, but just to jump in quick on what you were saying.
Sure, sure.
I read Guattari's daughter's her little, like, it's a very like lyrical sketch of her childhood, and she grew up in the asylum. Their children played among the inmates. They were not scared of them
That's
at
right.
all, which she describes as a bucolic childhood. And the only time she describes the other children, the children born after her, being afraid is when they moved, I think it was the children's center, further away from the asylum. And she described them, they grew up with an embarrassed distance towards the inmates, but her generation didn't.
You're exactly right. Almost all the sociological and psychological studies show that schizophrenia in its so-called proper state does not have an exaggerated tendency towards violence, right? It becomes violently overactivated because of the worlds of judgment, stigma, persecution that very tangibly exist in institutionalized society. That's when suddenly the stuff goes bad, right? And you get the school shooter, and you get that. Also, I mean, you look at their profiles. They're bullied, they're ostracized. There's a lot of that stuff that goes on that has less to do with schizophrenia itself. Now, quickly, just to Andrew's point, thank you for that, Heather, because you're absolutely right on that. Is when he said it's within you, and yet it's something like your skeleton, something as kind of incommunicable, like it's not something you can control or discourse with or talk to or anything like that. So it's embedded, but also foreign. There is a type of mad delusion where it often happens in children, tragically. Suddenly they come to their parents and they feel like their left arm doesn't belong to them and that they want to cut it off. When it really goes to a hyperbolic level, it becomes the desire to self-mutilate, right? And the scary thing there is that they'll take any chance they can to try and sever the limb because they feel it's almost like a tumorous outgrowth, right? It's an unnatural substance. And no matter how much you try to reason and say, no, it's a symmetrical, physiological, look, I have two arms too. They'll say, no, this shouldn't be here. And the scary thing is that when they do get their chance and they put their legs, when they're older, often in dry ice, so that they have to be amputated, because that's the only way, not that I want to teach you these things, but that's kind of the only way to make it a goner or a lost cause, is to put it in dry ice. And then the nerve endings are so damaged that but you can see that they are, the sad thing is it's been documented that they're usually delighted in the aftermath. Even if they're confined to wheelchairs, unable to walk with their children anymore, they feel relieved of the foreign. So this goes to something interesting about that idea. By the way, Andrew, you're about 2 steps away from inventing Scientology too, with this idea that there are all these, like, there's xenobodies inside of our skeletons and they're not, you know, from us and all that. It's cool. You're onto it. You could make millions of dollars and be friends with Tom Cruise if you just learn how to monetize that intelligence of yours. But I'll give you a less contemporary cultish example. The great North African writer Ibrahim Al-Koni, who's one of my favorites. He has a book called The Bleeding of the Stone, which is about these magical gazelles in the mountains of Tunisia. And they're kind of these sacred creatures. You very rarely ever see them. They're very elegant. And he claims that by nature, they're docile. They're very peaceful and they're very tranquil, unless you touch their horns. If you touch their horns, suddenly you get a kind of furious, invigorated violence that comes from them, a rage. They bite, they kick, they scream. It's a trigger or a button. And that's what made me think of what you were talking about there with the skeleton almost. It's like, it doesn't have to be the totality of your being. What if you've just got a light switch in you, a thing in you that makes you other than what you are? Now you go to your Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, which is a great 19th century kind of schizophrenic mythology there, but it's even more complex. It's a cool exception because you're not always Estamira. You're sometimes Estamira. And you can actually learn the ways, like the Hulk, even there's like the bad, stupid, superheroic kind of version of it, you know, where he turns, anger makes him, someone dishonors him or whatever, but it can be something more absurd that could be the trigger. Now, the next interesting question for you there is, could you embed the skeleton, or could you learn the way that the skeleton curves, moves, so you could manipulate it or harness it? Even if it's not something under your direct dominion, is it something that if you studied intricately enough, you could trigger it when you needed it? It would be very helpful for you to be able to manifest gazelle-like rage if you needed to in a back alleyway in some metropolis someday, right? Or eloquence, or super intelligence of some level. And I gave this example to you guys once before, that when you talk to yourselves because you're scared or you're upset or something like that, you are essentially attempting a schizophrenic technique of fracturing yourself into a wiser, counselor version of yourself that can think better than you, right? That can be clearer than you, that can make better judgments than you. What the hell is that? So that tells you there is this propensity, just like what's called the, I can't remember, hysterical adrenaline syndrome, something like that, where mothers can lift cars, you know, off their kids who are trapped beneath. There are all these studies that are shown of psychosomatic power, right? It's what mystics have been doing for thousands of years. It's not even that special, right? Putting swords in your stomach, burning yourself and not feeling it. So these things need to be studied more. Unfortunately, they stopped getting studied around 1917 because Dr. Freud didn't like it. He considered it pseudoscientific to look into paranormal or psychosomatic behaviors. And in fact, if you guys watch the film A Dangerous Method, which is not an inaccurate staging to some extent of Freud and Jung's relationship, but there is actually a famous encounter where they're sitting in an office and Jung claims that he knows that a light bulb is going to suddenly go off and a book is most likely going to fall off the shelf, and it does. And Freud gets up and storms out because he's like, I've been working on intuition. I swear I have this feeling like that this light bulb's going to pop again, and it pops, and Freud goes, I'm out of here. This is going to ruin my whole enterprise. I've been building the brand for decades as a legitimate scientific practice, and you're talking about, I know the light bulb's going to blow. Yeah. So, but nevertheless, these things persist and they happen and all of that. And it's a very interesting empirical thing, very simple. Would you bet or not bet that Estamira has a higher pain threshold than ordinary human beings? Yeah, she has a higher physical pain threshold. I guarantee it. It's been studied in schizophrenics, right? That's why Alexander the Great, you know how he died? He was covered in like 172 gaping wounds on his body from battle. Should have killed 50 ordinary men or women, right? There's something weird to that, right? And if anybody knows about how adrenaline works in a fight, you don't feel the pain. You feel it later. Well, if you're constantly in those adrenal states, then you don't feel it ever, for the most part. All right, cool. Who else has got a weird Cuban image for me? I know we've got the presentations, but before we get to those in a few minutes.
Yeah, Jason, I think someone had a hand up. Is that Dylan? Did you have your hand up? Sorry.
Yeah. I just wanted to quickly comment on this skeleton conspiracy. But I think there's something really interesting. So there's a bit in Delanda's book, 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, talking about like bones and organic matter and leading this to essentially cities and the walls of a city as bone. And I think that there's an insight embedded in this conspiracy where like, so this Marx thing, like the weight of dead traditions on our minds like a nightmare. You can almost think of the walls of the city as kind of this like we're trapped inside of an old skeleton that's like been victorious or something, right? So I think like being confined within inherited social structures can lead into this kind of a delusion, maybe. Yeah.
This is really important, Dylan, because okay, so we know that Derrida, for instance, is super interested in traces, right? It's a major concept and all that. He reads texts as traces, right? So they're kind of these debris or fractals that have been left over, these particles, and they exude all kinds of possibilities. And there's always a ghost in the machine, he would say, of writing too, because if you write about something that happened to you when you were 7, it's not quite you who's writing it. You know, the you who experienced it is not there to offer testimony. That's why there's no pure witnessing, right? But also the other people who were there weren't there. Also the world that was there isn't there anymore. So all these problems. This is, again, to give immense credit to my arch enemy. Do you know where he starts his predilection for tracing? Comes from Freud. And he says that outright. Psychoanalysis is the first real philosophical school that develops an acute analysis of traces, right? And it comes from first these weird nervous tics that Freud starts to notice. People who are blinking too much, or overactive leg syndrome, right? Where some of you probably have this, right? And he's like, what the hell is trying to get out there? They're telling me a story, but the leg is going nuts. I didn't even notice it. There's traces all over imprinted upon us. And to be a reader of those traces is a criminal endeavor that you got to give Freud, again, massive, massive credit for. That's pure sorcery when he's like, while they're talking, I'm going to pretend I'm listening. I'm going to be watching everything they don't notice that they're doing. One of the other things which has become now more common practice in contemporary psychiatry, but it's still not used, interestingly enough, is if you ask somebody to tell a traumatic story several times over and over and over again, you'll start to notice new details emerge. So they'll tell you the story, and then I was in the room, and say it again. What happened again? I was in the room, and by the seventh, my uncle, you didn't say your uncle was there. Now the traces start to appear through repetition. Right? So there's a lot to that. Yeah, and you got to give psychoanalysis its due. It's just that they tried to make a kind of cohesive meaning of the traces. And what you said, Dylan, and what Andrew said is the traces don't always come from you. Sometimes they're tattooed on you by other things, by worlds. That's what we call history. And actually, this is where Derrida reads Marx too, Spectres of Marx. And he starts reading ghosts and phantomology into Marxism. And he's absolutely right. And he goes, look at how much of it, hauntology, as you said, into Marxist narratives. And you see there are traces everywhere. And of course, it's inevitable if Marx's theory of dialectical materialism and historical materialism is, we take it as that wheel that it is, it's dragging every moment in history before it into the present. So of course you're not, by the way, one last thing to this, that one of the other major disagreements between Freud and Jung methodologically is that Freud went deep into the cellars of human history when he looks at totem and taboo, and he starts looking at tribal cultures and their totems. And then Jung laughs and he's like, dude, that's cool, but you're like millions of years too early still. Go back to the African plains when we were evolving as monkeys. There are inheritances from that. Why is it that the devil is always represented as a snake form? It's because the number one predatory beings in the trees in Africa that used to swallow us whole were snakes, which is why Inuit children in the Arctic poles have nightmares of snake-like creatures and they've never seen a snake. And they can draw snakes. Just saying, that's Jung's observation, that it goes way, way before even the first civilizations. Babylon is still young for us, right? So there's a lot of that. Yeah, we can do these tracings for us. So cool. Who do we got? We got 5 minutes before the professional presentations bust out.
I can share a quick one.
Please, Jim.
I'll share my screen. Extra click. Hopefully you're seeing the swamp.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote a little piece on it. There are unseen whispers, 3 and yet 1. The past, the present, the future, always behind you and out of sight. Bloated forms, swelling and slick, warm and soothing, recalls the womb. Wading naked into unconscious waters. Naked? Yes. An arm stretched to balance teetering steps into soft mud. Your curves of flesh ripple in reflective reply to your glance downward. Impossibly confused images present themselves on the liquid surface. They are strange and familiar, like a day on the beach, sunlight on your back. Dream guests before the embrace of sleep. That's it.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm going to start from the end and go back in a way. By the way, you used a word that Dan also used whispers. And I like that you guys are, and even traces and sort of that are kind of like a whisper. It's because you're developing an attunement, or you have an attunement correctly to Cuban's eerie kind of iconography. It's a whisper world, and Kafkaesque's world is an air, kind of a fog or a mist that is a whisper, a world of whispers as well. You're absolutely right there. The waiting, by the way, that you mentioned, Maurice Blanchot, who's a phenomenal author. If you go and you read not his philosophical work only, but his literary work. So he's got a piece called, a short story called Thomas the Obscure, which is a kind of cool name, Thomas the Obscure. The first imagery of Thomas the Obscure is he likes to swim alone, like out into the middle of the ocean and just drift there. And that's something, being in the drift, in a way, when you said waiting, there's a whole philosophy that you could do around the figure of the waiting and waiting pools and things like that. Dana, you would know this. I'm trying to look. Ali Asghar, you would know this too. The old hammams, the old bathhouses, sort of the Middle East. Which, by the way, there's a book like the hammam, last hammams of Cairo. It's a nice book that you can see the images of. But they're always these decadent, like underground kind of stone places. They're not luxurious. They've been converted now into like luxury spas in the West, but the original hammams were places that were notorious for all kinds of illicit behavior. Drug culture, sexual culture, things like that were in the sort of, they weren't the same as the public bathhouse either necessarily, where everybody just went to be washed. This is stuff you'd go to hang there, kind of loiter there, wade in the pool for a while. And yeah, there's a kind of a seediness to it and a decadent culture surrounding that that's similar to the opium den. So here's something you said, liquid surface. And it reminded me, I didn't get a chance to teach you guys a severe version of synesthesia. So many of you may know that synesthesia is a kind of mental state, you could say, or cognitive or perceptive state where you mix up the senses, quite literally, or senses can substitute for one another. So people who can hear colors, people who can see colors when they hear a number, all these sorts of different things that can take place. But many people don't know, and Heather rightly said Nabokov had it. Absolutely, he did. But those are mild synesthetics. Severe synesthetics don't live long in the world. Their madness becomes terminal almost because they become so dysfunctional. It's an extremely rare form of synesthesia where it basically is characterized by the inability to differentiate boundaries between anything. Hence, everything is liquefying and melting into everything else. There's no concept of, I put my hand on the table, right? Instead, you can think of almost a melting universe in which hand is already table. So language acquisition becomes almost impossible for these severe synesthetics because language is based on differentiation, right? As well as meaning becomes difficult for them, but also something that, and here's someone who I don't mention often, Merleau-Ponty very interestingly noted once, where he said, whenever you ask somebody, what sense would you least want to lose in the modern age? They always go, I wouldn't want to be blind. Like 100% of people say that because we're in the age of the Enlightenment. So everything is visual. I see what you mean. If you can't see, you can't mean, right? So it's the worst of it. But then you say, okay, next, I don't know, I wouldn't want to be deaf. Second, lose my hearing. Okay, third, I don't know, sense of smell. What idiots everybody are, that they don't realize that the one sense that if you ever lost, you make you a completely ridiculous, impossible being is touch. And the fact that no one ever thinks so, you wouldn't be able to eat, you wouldn't be able to walk, because you wouldn't be able to perceive where surfaces are, right? You'd be in James' world of a liquid surface, where you're always falling through, you're always sinking, right? Some of you may know this if you've ever woken up with your leg asleep, or your arms, that awful feeling, or that weird feeling that you just gotta wait it out until sensation returns. And it's like a huge lump of just flesh that is there, dead flesh sort of and all that can't do anything. if you lose touch, and then he meditates for a second, but he doesn't take it far enough. Michel Serres does in the five senses. Merleau-Ponty says the fact that none of them answer correctly and say the most unbearable, inconsumable, unfathomable destiny would be the loss of touch tells me that modernity has conspiratorially alienated us from touch. In a way, has excluded us from the domain of touch in such a severe way that we're not even conscious of it anymore as an immediate sense. Otherwise, it would come like that logically to you. So go read Michel Serres, The Five Senses, and he'll explain what happened to touch and how to get it back slowly. Right? Okay, cool. We have our three. Jonathan, you want to tell me who our three presenters are for the
day? We got three presenters. We've got Enda today, and then Nikki, and then Felipe. I'm not sure what order you guys want to go in. Maybe Enda, if that's okay. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I don't mind. Whatever.
Yeah, whenever you're ready. Cheers.
Okay, maybe I'll share my screen. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the image that I chose was probably the most literal one, and I really didn't want to choose the most literal image that I could, but just ended up being the one. So yeah, it is what it is. So I'll just read it out. Each night I await his arrival in a mire of sweat, jaundiced, febrile, restless. He will not come to devour me in the night unless I surrender myself to sleep. I must not disobey him. Spend the night awake and he will become enraged. I am to be consumed and I will be regenerated, once again ready for an arduous day of work. The day shall make my body feeble and tender. On occasions when I am too frail to carry out my duties, I am permitted to pilot another. Our work is too significant. I simply cannot afford to become inert. He knows this. Do not misunderstand the arrangement. You would do well not to get things the wrong way around. I am grateful to him. I am glad to be eaten. Only I know the truth, that he consumes all living souls in the night. I am the sole custodian. Only I am permitted to experience it, and even then indirectly. That is for my own sake. Even an individual of such peerless fortitude as I could not withstand these ineffable terrors. I may peer beneath the veil, just enough to understand. I receive handsome reward for my diligence. All souls are fermented into a grand bolus, the melange of spirit. All is redistributed in a night. When I awake, I am replenished. He allots to me the greatest portion, and in return, I am his faithful servant. Drifting off, you are enclosed by his devastating palm. Disassembled by millions of microscopic quartz machines, your flesh is undone particle by particle. Those more attentive may discern the distinctive odor of stainless steel, like that of an operating room table, or was it a flagpole? In this moment of visceral transit, I am cast into the great centrifuge. Amidst the vertiginous gyre, I become everything. All sensation in the universe belongs to me. In my most natural state, I am the absolute. However, it is essential to the greater plan of the tower that I become particulate, that I may control only a part of my vast resources at any one time. It is by his design that things are this way. Perhaps he is fearful that my unfettered power will usurp his authority. Perhaps he is right to be. I was made for myself, and I am made for myself. I am compressed like a pill, a hardened tablet. I am a half-dozen flowers swallowed whole, their thorns catching in the throat. I say forget-me-nots even though they are roses. Roses desiccated by infernal heat, looming heads upon petrified stems. I will live for 10,000 years and more. When a child passes away in the night, I am the beneficiary of his vital energies. You tell me that I should feel ashamed, but for what should I feel shame? If only you understood how things lie beyond the veil, you might begin to fathom the mockery he makes of sham concepts like shame. Your moral edifice shall crumble like brittle bones scorched in the blazing sun. A vital excess is transfigured into oil, rises like an army of spoots in the night, extracted by the light of the moon. What may colloquially be called spleen seeps through your joints and you awake feeling emptied. That's it. By the way, I'll just explain, spoots are like these kind of razor fish, and you can get them on the beach. You just put sand and they like pop up. So I put a little footnote to help people understand.
I was going to ask what that was.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, wow, beautiful. Let's start with this. First thing that appears to me, I mean, you have the image, but you also have the description of a kind of nightly devouring or continual chronic devouring action. If you notice, the child's imagination in the fairy tale world is often of predatory beings in the forest who want to eat them, right? So the witch in Hansel and Gretel wants to devour them. The big bad wolf wants to devour Little Red Riding Hood. But there's a really treacherous, obvious interpretive move you have to make, which goes against our ethics, right? And is getting to that, which was beautiful. The lack of shame and and even the gratitude, the weird gratitude that goes there. Okay, if the child's relationship to the predator was one of our modern society's one, right, where they are pure evil and they're the criminal and they're the whatever, then the last color you should wear entering the forest to attract the wolf is red. Right? That's I don't want to use the word seductive in case you get me wrong, but it's an attractive color to animality, right, across the board. And it's also just something that stands out in the forest, right? Ask the American revolutionaries who were able to beat the redcoats because they stood out among the branches, right, when the British came. The point is, it's not good camouflage. What is the child's relationship to these beings that want to eat them? Is it one of pure fear? Well, then why enter the forest in the first place? The forest is a space of unnecessary travel for the most part. Yeah, they give Little Red Riding Hood a little bit of a reach. She's got a sick grandmother that she's got to visit. But the rest of them just wander, knowing the creatures are there to devour them. There is something, and it's a masochistic psychology that we have to inhabit. There is something wondrous about being chosen to be eaten. Right? Also, there's not a moral condemnation because she knows that the wolf wants to eat her because he's hungry and it feels good. There's nothing abnormal or perverse or, or brutal or sadistic about that. It's the being is hungry and it feels good. It's a sensorial sort of gesture. But nevertheless, being chosen to be devoured is a really interesting thing. One of the things I lament that sort of Enda's bringing back is that this is how early folklore perceived the vampire's bite. Now it has become coterminous with pain, with agony, with torment to be bitten. But in all your early East European vampiric folklore, the bite is ecstatic. It's euphoric, right? So that's something there. And if you understand it, it's part actually, again, let's give the master his credit. What is Freud's love drive? Okay, so Freud's death drive, right? Eros and Thanatos, love drive, death drive. His death drive is an interesting tripartite combination of the desire to kill, the desire to die, and the desire to be immortal. The perfect combination, perfect storm entity that brings these together, the monster. Whether it's the vampire or the mummy or the zombie. They kill, they die, they are immortal. See how they can weave that nice, those three together simultaneously. Well, love drive is not the Valentine's Day romantic abstract kind of love. The important love drive is about the desire to consume the other. A state of passion that is so intensified that you want to devour it. That's why you tell the baby, oh my God, you're so cute, I could just eat you up. That's why you Christians feed on your God's flesh and blood every Sunday, right? Because it's the rapture, it's the passion of the Christ. It's the most intimate gesture. And that is even why to this day, ritualistically, it persists that on Valentine's Day, you buy chocolates for your lover and take them out to eat. And the organ of choice of affection is the mouth. Could be any number. There are tribes that have other organs of affection, by the way. There are other forms of sort of that, but for the most part, it's that because it's the gesture of inhalation or absorption or of digestion of the other into oneself, right? That's okay. That's Freudian classical love drive there. So this is an interesting thing because you can read it then in a weird, twisted way that Enda's sort of figure there. It's a gesture of affection or of intimacy. But then you even made it more complicated by adding regeneration, right? And replenishment. You use these words and all that of recurrence and all that. And it's almost like the Promethean agony that every day he gets fed upon, right? By the eagle who eats out his liver, he bleeds out, and then he's resurrected in the morning to undergo the same trial. It's an interesting thing there, because presumably the question that you should ask yourself is it more or less painful the 7,000th night that Prometheus dies? You would assume, does pain get worse or better? Well, this is an interesting little philosophical question about pain. Your doctor, who's going to take your blood, do a blood test, when they go to do the blood test, if you tell them, I don't like needles, I really hate needles, what do they tell you to do? Look away. So the medical establishment's basic theory of pain is, if you don't know it's coming and it's a surprise, it's easier to endure, right? But then I can tell you about political prisoners in Iran who have told me they've been in mock executions, which is to say they've been let out before a wall and one of 200 people are shot and you never know if it's you. And after 3 times of doing this, you beg to be the one put out of your misery, because the certainty of the pain and of death is better than the uncertainty. So who's right, the doctor or the prisoner? They both are. It sucks either way. Right? There's no way out of the double bind. The thing, whether it's a complete ambush or surprise, that's what the terrorist banks on, the suicide bomber, right? But dread is also a problem. They're just different states. Terror is not dread. Terror has the element of surprise. Dread has the element of anticipation. That's what mafia uses. Well, we might see each other again. And you're like, damn it, this is going to suck for all life. To always be under the shadow of this, right? So there's something to that question of, interesting, the reason I asked this is, could your neo-schizophrenic figure who's narrating, if the experience of being eaten each day would become intensified through repetition, then you're onto something there. You're really onto an arc. And you almost seem to hint at it with the kind of affirmation and almost adoration with which you speak, like it's getting richer. Instead of the Promethean numbing, Prometheus gets more and more numb, more and more futile. And it's not that it hurts more, it's that it becomes more absurd, more banal. And that's the worst torture. Like, here we go again, right? The monotony of it. The last thing I want to say about it was, you mentioned the faithful servant. That's really interesting. In horror genres, you often have like these Igor characters who are the assistant or whatever. Bataille has an article that a lot of people don't read called The Sorcerer's Apprentice in Visions of Excess. It's actually not about sorcerers or apprentices really until the end. But at the end, he starts to actually be true to his title and start to get into it. But the figure of the apprentice, the figure of the disciple, the figure of the faithful servant is a very, very powerful figure. They're excused from all moral accountability because they're just doing what they're told at some level. But they also have a weird level of devotion that is a fascinating thing. You could do a whole study on that figure. Lastly, you also said it's his design. This is the experience of when you wake up in a labyrinth, you know that you're in an environment that is someone else's design, of someone else's making. And what happens when you have that sensibility? Often we walk through the world. See, we often think that there's 2 ways of interpreting outer reality. Either you can be this delusional humanist who's like, yeah, I'm at home in the world. The world is my mother and I'm spiritually aligned with it and I'm one with the universe. And that's great. That's good. And do your yoga on Saturday and enjoy, right? Or you can be like my friend Eugene Thacker, who, is always, the world without us and it cares for nothing. That's cool too. But to be honest, that gets a little bit old after a while also. It's far more devious to suspect that someone did design the world and it's not your design. And it doesn't necessarily work for you. And good luck navigating it. It may be even set against you. Now you're in the conspiracy theories of the schizophrenic like Estamira. This is the punster's world, right? And I have to navigate it and elude and dodge and make it around that. That's interesting when you're in someone else's design. right? And they're not fully clear what their intentions are towards you. Finally, you said parasite. I mentioned Michel Serres earlier. One of his great books is called Parasite. I don't know if you know it, and a great book by him. And it's like chapter 1, rats' meals. Chapter 2, cows' meals. Chapter 3, satyrs' meals. Weird book. Amazing table of contents, but it's about the figure of the parasite. Oh, there's somebody at the News Center who's teaching a course, I think, in the art section, where they're using Michel Serres' paradigm of the parasite to discuss the art world in some way. The Post Brothers, that's right. Oh, thank you. So I'll put a shout out to them. I hope they mean it in a positive way, the way that he does, and not just like artists have become parasites of capitalism or something like that, because it's actually a cool figure, the parasite. Excellent. Thank you, Enda. Thank you for a brilliant thing. Where are we going next?
Yeah, it's Nikki or Felipe, whichever one.
Nikki, go ahead, please.
Hey, everyone. I was trying to pick a moment where the furnace wasn't like making a ton of noise, but I think it'll be okay if it's not too bad. I'm gonna try to share my image.
Wow, nice. I like that all of you keep prefacing, like, you didn't do this anything, but like my image is kind of, I don't know how any of these images are like plain or boring. They're all bizarre. Great choice. Please, go ahead.
Yes, this image is called Oblivion. The quote by Estemira that I chose is this: "It is only the form that is common. I will explain all of it to you now, to the whole world. Your brains have been blinded, your bloody recorders, but they couldn't blind my brain because I'm in a human form. Fresh blood in the form of an even man. That's their grudge on me, the punster's grudge on me. The accursed, unholy, hypocritical, scoundrel, undignified, incompetent. Do you know what he did? He lied to men, he seduced men, he blinded men, and tossed them into the abyss." From that passage, I decided to go a route that focused on the environment too, and I was interested in this, maybe this image being in a prison, maybe in a solitary confinement. You think you are alone just because you have stopped talking? I'm never alone. In all my madness, I am not alone. I think I am waiting. When my neck is back, I can see the word poetry etched onto the ceiling of the tunnel. I'm reminded by the traces of others who have gone on to transparent journeys that it's been almost a millennium since my arrest. I am here to rest. By the force of law, I am here. In an unknown dialect, one line in the tunnel is my favorite. It says, translated, "Law is the prejudices of the community." Words are not my business. I think I am not a thinking being, rather an emotional being. I carry death, and so I am penetrated by a glorious and peaceful silence. The tranquility is good. The noises from the tunnel are all gone. I feel the universe expand as I wait for night to purge the heavy explosives that the gang squad hides in my large body each day. As an additional form of torture, I've been kept up, sleepwalking. I'd find narcotics in conscious paranoid visions. That is how I found death. I'd say to death, I'd rather detonate here, explode with the night sky, and wake half addicted to the air and to fake liberation. My arms and neck stretch out for liberation, but they start becoming bone and flesh. In this form, I am confined, and when my arms go down, I slip into a dream and sit around an eminent sand mandala with a room full of archetypes having a conversation about my indictment. A cautious hand wakes me up to remind me that I am being watched, not because I am guilty. I keep thinking I am paranoid, but then I remember I'm unable to adjust to this corruption, and I believe my paranoia is justified. I'm assured that these fascists have never had a real prosecutor, so even their warrants are not real. A rumor is leaked that the tunnel is being staked out by the police and that they might not be looking to have a go at me. Only Egypts believe the full extent of the law leads to order. No, it doesn't. It leads to prison. My own laughter slides down my throat and tries to repossess whatever is down there. Death whispers to me with a tranquil voice. What does he tell the others? I'd rather detonate, but I utter AM and am absorbed into the blackness. My essence spills into the emptiness surrounding me. I feel my total identity approaching. The bomb in my mind finally wants out. Does death not notice the blood I am spilling just to open one eye and slip into being with the gigantic one? I find myself in the tunnel, me, the animal of my hallucination. Somewhere in the last hour, I had lost my body. The tranquility has been good, but what good is it? Another rumor is leaked that the underground thought police have been activated. I feel the universe expanding just to say, God is just. I think I'm waiting for a different communication or for that magic guillotine to release me. That's it.
Nice. I don't want to deflect to talking about the guillotine at the end. I like that you love the adjective of the magic one. You know, the guillotine really is the instrument that is the herald of the modern age with the French Revolution. I mean, you could say that's probably the symbolic object of the, you know, and kind of the first rudimentary, crude gesture of technology at some level of the modern age as well. So we could get into you started with the title of the image is Oblivion, you said, right, Nikki? Right. It's a fascinating question because oblivion is, I always like to say this, you know, there's a reason why English has a grotesque history because of what it's been a part of globally, but it has magnificent sort of tentacular qualities as well. You know, I've studied many languages and I've never encountered more vast vocabularies. And I think it's just a empirical fact that English has more words like by a vast amount than any other language, but also synonyms. That's why I was going to say that. So interesting thing is, just like if you wanted to come up with a word for destruction, you just look at them: devastation, obliteration, annihilation, extinction, desolation, decimation. Why do we have all of these? You know, unless English has become kind of the repository of just a centrifuge of etymologies over time, and because they mean slightly different things. Decimation is not quite the same as desolation, is not quite the same as devastation or destruction. In fact, Heidegger has a meditation on the difference between destruction and devastation in the German language, and that they're different qualities. The reason I bring that up is that oblivion is not identical to nothingness. And I think the reason I bring it is because I think you actually got it. You know, you painted a kind of a sketch of oblivion, which is not the absolute nothing, not the void. You know, in a sort of that solitary confinement with that creature down there. The things that start happening don't happen in the nothing. In the same way that Nietzsche intentionally takes the term abyss and thinks there's something really powerful and resonant about that, rather than just saying nothingness. Yeah, you're onto something there. And by the way, if you want to look, if you did want to spend time developing a philosophy of oblivion, I would tell you to go look at Latin American poetry, because you'll find that figures like, even like Neruda or Lorca, they use the word el olvido all the time. And el olvido means oblivion, but it also means forgetting, quite literally, the forgetting. So just check it out. You'll notice that it's a major part of their writing. Solitary confinement, the way you described it, yeah, exactly. And the talking with yourself, and then all that. What a great sort of way of perceiving that figure down there. When you said a millennium has passed, right? You're in that Borges kind of universe where numbers become so extended that they become irrelevant. And so I think it's in Borges's library, where maybe the library, or it may be his work on the Labyrinth and the Minotaur, House of Asterion, where he says I think it's that one where he says there are 14 something, but then there's a footnote that says actually the word that he uses is infinite, but the translator decided to put 14. They're like, in Borges, it doesn't matter. Any number becomes the infinite. It's a weird little slip or like conniving gesture on the translator. It's not Borges, it's the translator. Decides to put a numerical number on Borges' use of the word infinite. It's a cool little gesture. But that's the same thing, that when the days roll on and the years, and in solitary confinement, the inscription of days or years on the wall, and you just keep writing and etching them, yeah, 1 becomes 5, becomes 15, becomes 50. If you go to Nazim Hekmat, who's a great Turkish poet who was buried in Russia, though, because he was exiled from Turkey, I think he did, I want to say he did 17 years in prison, but I may be wrong on that. But he has a poem called Some Advice for Those Who Will Serve Time in Prison, where he provides you a manual of instructions of how to endure. And at one point he says, and you might do 9 years or 11 or 13. And it's terrifying how easily he slips from 9 to 11 to 13, as if he's just adding grocery list items, right? That's what happens sort of in the solitary, as you describe it very well. I carry death. Ooh, powerful line. It interests me because it's a question of, is it an act of personification or is it an act of apotheosis? There's a difference. So if you take like Thanatos and Hypnos, the gods of sleep and death, they're brothers, or they're half brothers in the Greek mythology. Those are personifications, meaning that they're abstract forces, death and sleep, who have been personified. But your figure seems like an apotheosis, meaning it started as this regular shape, and then it became the walking, living embodiment of an abstract force. I carry death. And not to make a weird historical example, but Genghis Khan once, when he arrived at a town that he was burning to the ground, said famously, I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed such sins, he would not have sent me to punish you. That's a famous line of Genghis Khan. I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying that, it's a difference to become the apotheosis of a force rather than the personification. That's what I think you did there really well with I carry death and these things. The explosives, the gang squads, great, just kind of storytelling mixed in, weird storytelling, because what I love is the details in a Kafkaesque kind of way don't really help clarify. They just, you know what I mean? Like they don't give you like, oh, so that's what happened to this weird white being that's down there in the thing and all that. It's just now there are gang squads and there are explosives being placed upon them, but you're not quite sure of the purpose of them. Again, Kafka has a way of doing this too, where every time he opens a detail, it opens 3 more doors of confusion, right? So I always give that example when he says something like, I woke up and an old man, toothless man in a trench coat sits in the corner. Great, who's the old man? Why is he toothless? Why is he wearing a trench coat? Do you know him? Is it your grandfather? Right, is he there to kill you? Is he there to help? It doesn't help. Toothless doesn't, and he can keep giving you details and it's still not gonna help. And you did that kind of here too. Great storytelling, narrative details without that. You mentioned the sleepwalker, and you mentioned the rumor is leaked. That's really, really important because when we're talking about oblivion, we talked about whispers earlier with Dana and James's points and all that, but now the rumor is its own kind of sinister variation on the whisper. And so to say that he enters the realm of rumor is really powerful. So you might, if you're constructing a whole philosophy of a kind of an apotheosis figure of oblivion and of the solitary, yeah, the fact that they become rumor is a beautiful endpoint for that. What kind of rumor, that's up to you. Cool. Oh, Essen, thank you. Yeah, Nazim Hikmet, 28 years, my bad. There you go. Okay, where are we going next? Who's our last figure?
Felipe's the last one, I think. And though we're at time, I think we're okay to go over by a few minutes.
Yeah, sure.
That's okay with everyone.
As long as you guys can take it, I'm in.
Cool, great.
So it's me. Hi there. I'll share my screen and what do I want to show you? Are you seeing anything?
Not yet.
Not yet. There you are. Yeah, it's coming up.
Okay, this is the dying city. And just some introductory remarks. During my viewing of Estamira, I noticed that her body is her pain. Otherwise, she's always free to surf the world with language, and she even impresses her name, as you mentioned a while ago. She impresses her name onto the sea, Estamira, Estamar, the sea, and so what I'm reading is that language is for her the main act of alienation, of externalization. So I picked this image by Kuban because I hadn't seen Oblivion though, but I thought, oh, something outside. So this is Kuban's most external image that I found. So glossophrenia, a madness which is out on the street describing itself. And my starting point was Estamira's phrase, the whole of creation is abstract. I saw the film in Portuguese because it's my native language, and this is my translation of her sentence. I don't know how you read it in your viewings. So the job in us is the whole you have no word for. Atomic omissions, museums defenestrated into our belly abysses. Toda a criação é abstrato. All toads die in my toadity. This gets full bloated to a point of all returns and all translucent wet skin, and many one a dictionary, every none. So you need a lullaby and an eology about an alley, an avo. We're only breathless because I make me spend air on answers to endless forms about forms, emissions of omissions. You're making me be you as a door closing on your toe, a book pressing on our finger, which wasn't there against forgetfulness, but it turns out imprisoned by the pitch black pain of compressed, simplified, thus murdered words. I could be you. I even should. If A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, let's go, please, friend. One could be singing the porousness of 700-year-old buildings, listening like scat singers do with one hand cupped over one's ear to every moment of laziness from every home when the city died every Sunday, and to the worlds that can be written in those interstices, be they plastic, chitinous, or granite. That's the job, the daily eschaton. The imagination of a better, sweeter living. I hate secrets. I decode every grimoire and purge every office of their sophistry, for it was that which destroyed Babel. I am the termination of ignorance and the reanimator of pure understanding. The truest cockroach, the one that is the stories of its flights, its feats of orthogonal cartography in this sprawling city. an endlessly pliable frog tongue. We navigate sewers, windows, tunnels, theaters, and sue intelligibilities out of corpses, tying our tongues in knots out of time. We mean everybody, but we mean nobodies, though, thought. I mean an end to their cruelty, a diaspora from the meat. We mean the sails propelled by every single other's pregnant buoyancy. We kill the weird with dreams, put fear to sleep in my arms. I don't want to go back into my mother. I can be able to find her in everything. And so can you. Good, bad, best, worst, fuck you. Do you even know the name of the hole you dug yourself into? Yes, I'll scream and howl as a fartful wind across your city at you. Can't you see I am too? Those fetid words and that mere repetition is annihilation. You is only an activity, an intestine of the we that is every I. We are the floodlights placing themselves across every inch of your tripe, the chiaroscuro between I and anyone. Memory isn't what is right, it is what right we can make out of it. The city should be always dead. We are exterminators and rememberers of holes, closers of folds, indeed. Still, we acknowledge my glue is merely spit. We weave hospitality unto the world, for I am a traveler, mad, sad, bodied. You begged for a hotel as a mirror. I am the mirror, you snob. I built hospice around our ears. I even taught you to make a womb out of your mouth. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. You know, I have to say this. You know, I'm very honored by the way everyone rises to the occasion in just the sheer kinds of writing that are emerging so far and that have emerged in the past when I've taught at New Seneca. I know a lot of you before. We've been in the game, many of us before, but even the newcomers, just I wish, in some ways, I wish others could see what great things are happening here. But then at the same time, I like the luxury item of being able to be one of the, few people who knows how great your writing is, all of you. So this is impressive. I wouldn't just say that if I didn't mean it. It's insane, the kind of writing that's happening here, and you've got it. You know, you've got a lot of tricks up your sleeves, and you're getting it. I almost don't want to say too much because I think that was a really elegant ending. Thank you, Felipe. Just again, 3 detonations in a row again today. But just quickly, I hate secrets. You're absolutely right. This is a figure who has no repression, and that's precisely what the psychoanalyst would be terrified of. A figure like Estamira who has no repression whatsoever, doesn't hide anything, doesn't bury anything. But you even had, in the Dying City, you had the reference to the museum. That's a really intriguing connection there. You say the lullaby and I think you said eulogy, but it could be elegy as well, right? The lullaby and the elegy, which is a death song. You know, it's the thing that we read sort of at the moment of mourning. And my God, you could do lullabies. Often are elegiac because lullabies are often violent, if you know them. In a way, there's often death in the lullaby, which is the weird part of it, because they're meant for children, and that's not wrong. The child has a very strange psychological connection, and forget psychological, existential connection to death. There's even again, to give him his credit real quick, Freud notices the Da Fort game. Have you guys ever heard of this? He had I think it's his grandson that he's watching, and he keeps on playing this weird game where he keeps hiding this army figurine that he has. And his father is at war at the time, and he keeps hiding it and then delightfully bringing it back up, like playing kind of a hide and seek with the figurine, and is just erupting into laughter. And Freud quickly interprets that he is performing the disappearance of his father in the war. And the scary thing is, he keeps telling his daughter too, like, this is kind of weird, because he's actually throwing his father literally into the abyss and then wrenching him out gleefully, almost like a god with power, to bring him back. But he's getting adjusted to the vanishing of the father. And she's like, you're reading too much into it, Dad. And then he died. Freud's son-in-law died in the war, and the kid felt nothing, Freud says, because he had practiced it. He was ready for the, so there's something that the elegy is a really, really powerful, ancient construct. The first elegy writers were women, by the way, in ancient civilizations, and they were often oral. They would go on the hills and they would wail from the hilltops. And often they weren't words or poetics, they were sounds.
The keening.
That's right, the keening, exactly. And so you might even look, Felipe, into the Irish kind of folk horror figure of the banshee, who's the woman who shrieks, kind of, and is a calling of death. A lot of great things there, by the way. Real quick, you said she's omissions and all of that. When you meet a schizophrenic, you're always going to notice omissions. There's always pieces missing, because you're always catching them in the effusion, right? So they don't start sort of at any given point. And so you've got to just wait it out and hope they cycle back and recuperate things and puzzle piece it together at some level. So yeah, it always feels like omissions. Reanimator, you called it. What a great title that is. The figure who can reanimate things, who has that touch, is a gruesome and also cherished figure in history. The one who can bring things back. And the question always with figures who have the power of reanimation, the one who can bring back your dead loved one, or, in these stories and narratives and legends, is, do they return the same? So and the answer is usually not quite, right? We navigate sewers. I thought to myself that they're a form of quick street culture and guerrilla warfare. Child gangs in Eastern Europe or North Africa, when I've come up against them, they're the most fearsome, because they use their multiplicity, they use their littleness, they use their cuteness and their presumed innocence, right? And they also use, again, their smallness as a weapon. Their hands get in pockets more quickly, right, and things like that. But they can also use their miniaturism and their stature to escape into places that you can't follow them. So they can get under things, and they can get into places like the sewers and stuff like that very quickly, or through windows that you can't follow them. There's something
Artful
to that.
Dodger.
What was that?
The Artful Dodger.
The Artful Dodger, there you go. Repetition is annihilation. My God, we could sit for hours and go over that philosophically. And the city should be always dead. That's quite a declaration. I'm going to leave it at that, and we'll pick that up for next week. Next week, we're moving on to an intriguing one as well. This was a heavy dosage, but we're going for heavy doses each time. We're going backwards. We're going to go into the insane asylum of the hysterical women with Dr. Charcot, Freud's master. We're going to haunt the halls with the women of hysteria. Your reading is the first 20 pages, not of a mad figure, of actually a contemporary author, Didi Uberman, the last name. You're reading The Invention of Hysteria, the first 20 pages of it. That's uploaded for you. And the figure that I want you to use to construct your own prototype of the hysteric is the Mexican painter Remedios Varo. Some of you know her. Okay, so you'll get an email mentioning that, but Remedios Varo, pick a single image again and trace it. Follow it into whatever type of hysterical or post-hysterical imagination you want to. And I will send you guys some of the short articles where I was referencing some of the more experimental forms of schizophrenia. From a little short article on the influencing machine to I mean, all things are like one page, but I just want you to see some of this stuff. The one on lucid dreaming, that's the MIT Media Lab that's developing a technology that for the first time ever has been able to communicate in real time with lucid dreamers. That's intriguing. You're at the breakthrough threshold of all kinds of stuff we shouldn't be trying. But anyway, Jonathan, you had something that you wanted to tell everybody, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Thanks for everyone for presenting as well in the formal and informal presentations. Just a couple of things in regards to the presentations, because there's so many of us now. We've actually grown since we started. That I've changed the sign-up sheets. Now there's 4 people per session going forward. I don't think that will capture everyone, but like that will do. It's pretty good because they're quite long, these presentations. There's also the Discord server is still knocking around, and that's growing and that's doing well. So join that, and I will send links to everything on the Google Classroom and everything. I know because there's people just starting in the new center, they might not know where everything is. So I'll send a mass email with everything again. So sorry if it's duplicated for people who've already seen that, but just ignore that. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. See you.
Take care.
Thank you.